The enclosure. The enclosure. Elena Cruz pressed her badge against the security scanner and listened to the familiar beep that granted her entry into the Detroit Zoo's staff area. The February morning air bit at her exposed cheeks as she made her way through the empty pathways, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the pre-dawn darkness. At 31, she had been working with the zoo's Arctic mammals for 8 years, longer than any other keeper in the department. The polar bears were her specialty, her passion, and increasingly her obsession. The zoo wouldn't open to the public for another 3 hours, but Elena always arrived early. She told herself it was because the animals needed consistent care, that the feeding schedules couldn't wait, that the enrichment activities required careful preparation. But lately, she had begun to suspect there was another reason entirely. She needed to watch them before they knew she was watching. Dr. Marcus Webb, the zoo's head veterinarian, had noticed Elena's increasingly early arrivals. A methodical man in his mid-50s with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, Webb had worked in zoological medicine for over 2 decades. He prided himself on reading people as well as he read animals, and something about Elena's recent behavior concerned him. She had always been dedicated, perhaps overly so, but in the past month her dedication had taken on an edge that made him uncomfortable. "Morning, Elena," Webb called out as he spotted her silhouette near the polar bear habitat. "You're here early again." Elena startled, spinning around with a jerky movement that wasn't like her usual graceful efficiency. "Dr. Webb, I didn't hear you coming." "The bears keeping you up at night?" Webb asked, approaching slowly. In the dim light, he could see dark circles under her eyes, and her usually pristine uniform looked wrinkled, as if she'd slept in it. "Something like that," Elena replied, turning back toward the massive enclosure. Through the reinforced glass, the 2 polar bears, Nanook and Siku, were visible in the pre-dawn gloom. Nanook, the male, weighed nearly 1,200 pounds and stood over 10 feet tall on his hind legs. Siku, the female, was smaller but no less formidable at 800 pounds. They were magnificent creatures, apex predators whose very existence spoke to millions of years of evolution perfected for killing. Webb followed Elena's gaze and watched the bears moving through their habitat. Nanook was pacing along the edge of the pool, his massive head swaying from side to side in what appeared to be a repetitive, almost hypnotic pattern. "They seem restless lately," Webb observed. "They're planning something," Elena said quietly, so quietly that Webb almost missed it. "Excuse me?" Elena blinked and looked at Webb as if she'd forgotten he was there. "I said they're displaying some unusual behaviors. I've been documenting it." She pulled out a small notebook that looked worn from constant handling. The pages were filled with her cramped handwriting, dense observations about feeding times, movement patterns, and what appeared to be detailed behavioral analyses. Webb reached for the notebook, but Elena clutched it against her chest. "I'm not ready to share my findings yet. There's more I need to observe." The veterinarian studied Elena's face in the growing light. Her dark hair, usually pulled back in a neat ponytail, hung loose around her shoulders. Her brown eyes, which had always held warmth and intelligence, now seemed to dart constantly between him and the bears, as if she couldn't decide which posed the greater threat. "Elena, when's the last time you took a day off?" "I can't," she said immediately. "Not now. Not when they're like this." "Like what?" Elena turned back to the enclosure, where Nanook had stopped his pacing and was now standing motionless, staring directly at them through the glass. His black eyes seemed to focus specifically on Elena, and she could swear she saw something almost human in that gaze, recognition, intent. "He knows I'm watching him," she whispered. Webb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February cold. "Elena, I think you should go home. Get some rest." "You don't understand." Elena said, her voice gaining urgency. "I've been tracking their behavior patterns for weeks, the way they position themselves when staff approaches, the timing of their movements, the way they test the barriers. They're not just animals following instinct, Dr. Webb. They're planning." James Harrison, the zoo's director of operations, arrived at 7 a.m. to find Webb and Elena still standing by the polar bear exhibit. Harrison was a practical man in his early 40s who had worked his way up from groundskeeper to management over 15 years. He understood the delicate balance required to run a facility that housed over 2,000 animals while serving more than 1 million visitors annually. "Morning, you two," Harrison said, noting the tension immediately. "Everything all right?" Webb pulled Harrison aside while Elena continued her vigil at the glass. "I'm concerned about Elena. She's been here since before 6, and frankly, she's not making much sense." Harrison observed Elena, who was now taking detailed notes about the bear's positioning. "She's always been our most dedicated keeper." "This goes beyond dedication," Webb said. "She thinks the bears are plotting something." Before Harrison could respond, Sarah Martinez arrived for her shift. At 26, Sarah was the newest member of the Arctic Mammal Team, having joined just 6 months earlier after completing her degree in zoology. She was bright, enthusiastic, and had quickly bonded with Elena, viewing her as a mentor. But lately, Elena's mentorship had taken on an intensity that made Sarah uncomfortable. "Elena?" Sarah approached cautiously. "You're here early again." Elena barely acknowledged her. "Sarah, look at Nanook's positioning. See how he's angled his body toward the keeper entrance. Yesterday at this same time, he was in exactly the same spot. The day before, identical positioning. This isn't random behavior." Sarah looked through the glass at the massive bear, who was indeed facing the area where keepers entered the habitat for cleaning and feeding. "Maybe he's just learned the routine. Animals are creatures of habit." "No," Elena said sharply. "Habit implies unconscious repetition. This is conscious anticipation. He's waiting for the optimal moment." Dr. Rebecca Thompson, the zoo's animal behaviorist, joined the growing group of concerned staff members. Thompson was a woman in her late 30s with a PhD in animal psychology and over 10 years of experience studying captive wildlife behavior. She had published numerous papers on stress indicators in large mammals and had been instrumental in designing the enrichment programs that kept the zoo's animals mentally stimulated. "Elena," Thompson said gently, "I've been reviewing the behavioral logs you've submitted. Your observations are incredibly detailed, but I'm wondering if we might be attributing human-level cognition to natural animal behaviors." Elena's grip tightened on her notebook. "You think I'm imagining things." "I think you're seeing patterns because you're looking for them," Thompson replied carefully. "It's a common phenomenon called apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things." "Unrelated?" Elena's voice rose. "Dr. Thompson, I've spent more time with these bears than anyone else on staff. I know their normal behaviors, their feeding responses, their social dynamics. What I'm documenting now is completely outside their established patterns." Harrison stepped forward. "Elena, why don't you take the rest of the week off, get some rest, and we can discuss this when you come back." "Absolutely not," Elena said, backing away from the group. "You can't leave them unsupervised. Not now. Not when they're this close to making their move." The group exchanged worried glances. It was clear that Elena's mental state had deteriorated significantly, but the question remained of how to handle the situation without escalating it further. Dr. Amanda Foster, the zoo's chief of staff and a licensed psychologist who specialized in workplace mental health, arrived shortly after being called by Harrison. Foster was a woman in her early 50s who had seen her share of staff burnout and stress-related incidents. The zoo environment, despite its educational mission, could be psychologically challenging for employees who formed deep attachments to dangerous animals. Elena, Foster approached with the calm, measured tone she used in crisis situations. I understand you've been working very hard lately. Can we talk about what you've been observing? Elena's posture relaxed slightly at Foster's non-confrontational approach. Finally, someone who wants to hear the evidence instead of dismissing it. Foster nodded encouragingly. Why don't you tell me what you've documented? Elena opened her notebook with trembling hands. The pages were covered in meticulous handwriting, sketches of the bear's positions, timing charts, and what appeared to be behavioral analysis that would have impressed graduate-level ethology students. But as Foster read more carefully, she noticed that the observations became increasingly paranoid in tone. January 15th, 6:47 a.m., Elena read aloud. Nanook positioned at northwest corner of pool, facing keeper entrance. Maintains eye contact for 47 seconds when I approach glass. This is 14 seconds longer than his average interest duration. Siku positions herself at southeast corner, creating triangulation pattern that would allow for coordinated ambush if barrier were removed. Foster listened patiently as Elena continued reading entries that detailed increasingly complex behavioral theories. The bear's natural movements were being interpreted as tactical positioning. Their normal interest in humans was characterized as predatory reconnaissance. January 23rd, Elena continued. Nanook demonstrates understanding of schedule by moving to feeding area exactly 6 minutes before feeding time. This represents a mathematical calculation that suggests higher cognitive function than previously documented in polar bear literature. Elena, Foster interjected gently, animals learning feeding schedules is very common. It's actually a sign of successful habituation to captivity. But the precision, Elena insisted, the exact timing. And yesterday, when Kevin was cleaning the glass, Nanook followed his movements from inside the habitat. Not casual following, precise tracking, as if he was memorizing Kevin's routine. Kevin Sullivan, the maintenance worker Eleanor mentioned, was indeed present that morning. A stocky man in his late 40s who had worked at the zoo for 12 years, Kevin had cleaned every enclosure in the facility multiple times. He'd never felt particularly threatened by any of the animals, viewing them as part of his daily routine rather than potential dangers. Kevin, Foster called him over. Eleanor mentioned the polar bear was watching you yesterday while you cleaned. Kevin shrugged. Sure, they watch sometimes. Curious creatures. Nanook's always been interested in people. Nothing unusual about it. Eleanor stared at Kevin with an expression of disbelief. Nothing unusual. He tracked every movement you made. When you moved left, his head moved left. When you bent down, he positioned himself lower. He was mirroring your actions, Kevin. That's not curiosity. That's tactical observation. Doctor. Michelle Rodriguez, the zoo's director, arrived at the enclosure after receiving concerned calls from multiple staff members. Rodriguez was a respected zoologist in her mid-50s who had managed the Detroit Zoo for 8 years. She had dealt with staff crises before, but Elena's situation was unlike anything in her experience. Elena had always been her most reliable keeper, someone she trusted implicitly with the care of the zoo's most dangerous animals. Elena, Rodriguez said firmly but kindly, I need you to step away from the exhibit. Dr. Foster is going to talk with you privately. You can't remove me from my post, Elena said, her voice rising. I'm the only one who understands what's happening here, the only one who's been paying attention. As if summoned by the commotion, Nanook approached the glass where the staff was gathered. His massive form moved with surprising grace across the artificial tundra of the habitat. When he reached the barrier, he reared up on his hind legs, placing his enormous paws against the glass. The reinforced barrier was designed to hold over 10,000 pounds of pressure, but the sight of the 1,200-pound bear towering over them was undeniably intimidating. Elena stepped closer to the glass, separated from the bear by mere inches of transparent aluminum. "You see," she said to the group, "he's responding to our presence, but not randomly. Watch his eyes." The staff watched as Nanook's gaze moved deliberately from person to person, lingering on each face as if cataloguing their features. When his eyes met Eleanor's, they stopped moving entirely. The bear and the woman stared at each other through the barrier, and for a moment the assembled staff felt as though they were witnessing some form of primal communication. "He recognizes me," Elena whispered. "He knows I've been watching him, and he's been watching me back." Dr. Foster took Elena's arm gently. "Let's go to my office and talk about this properly." Elena allowed herself to be led away, but she kept looking back at the enclosure. Nanook remained at the glass, his massive head tracking her movement until she disappeared from view. In Foster's office, Elena sat rigidly in a comfortable chair while Foster reviewed the notebook more thoroughly. The early entries were standard keeper observations, feeding behaviors, enrichment responses, social interactions between the two bears. But as the weeks progressed, the tone shifted dramatically. Elena began attributing complex motivations to routine animal behaviors. "Elena, tell me about your sleep patterns lately," Foster said. "I don't sleep much," Elena admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them. Planning, waiting. What do you think they're planning?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the Arctic habitat. Escape isn't the right word. They're not looking for freedom. They're looking for opportunity. The barriers keep them contained, but they also keep us comfortable, complacent. We go into their space every day, believing we're safe because of glass and steel and concrete. But what if they understand the barriers better than we do? Foster made notes while Elena spoke. The delusion was sophisticated, built on genuine observation and real animal behaviors, but interpreted through an increasingly paranoid lens. "Elena, how long have you been having these thoughts?" "It started about 6 weeks ago," Elena said. "I was doing the evening feeding and Nanook was in the pool. Usually he ignores me when he's swimming, focused on his own activities. But that night he surfaced right in front of where I was standing and just watched me. For almost 10 minutes. He didn't move, didn't swim, didn't dive. He just watched. And that concerned you." "At first I thought it was interesting. Positive human-animal interaction, you know. But then I realized he wasn't watching me the way animals usually watch people. There was something calculating about it, like he was measuring me." Foster continued taking notes, recognizing the classic signs of paranoid ideation combined with hypervigilance. Elena had likely been under significant stress, possibly for months, and her mind was creating patterns and threats where none existed. "Elena, I want you to consider the possibility that your interpretation of the bear's behavior might be influenced by stress or fatigue. Working with dangerous animals day after day can create psychological pressure, even for experienced keepers." Elena shook her head vigorously. "I know what I've seen, and it's not just Nanook. Siku has been exhibiting coordinated behaviors. Yesterday, while Nanook was interacting with visitors at the viewing area, Siku was exploring the far corners of the habitat, areas she doesn't usually investigate. It's like they're working together to map every inch of their environment. Animals explore their environments regularly, Elena. It's healthy behavior." "Not like this," Elena insisted. "I've documented 17 instances in the past 3 weeks where their movements appeared coordinated despite no obvious communication between them. They're operating as a unit, Dr. Foster, a hunting unit." Meanwhile, back at the polar bear habitat, the morning feeding was being handled by David Kim, a keeper in his late 20s who had worked with Elena for 3 years. David was competent and careful, but he lacked Elena's intuitive understanding of the bear's personalities. As he prepared the morning meal, a carefully balanced combination of fish, seal meat, and specially formulated supplements, he noticed that both bears were positioned at the feeding area earlier than usual. "Eager this morning, aren't you?" David said aloud, a habit he'd developed over years of working with animals. Many keepers talked to their charges, finding that the sound of human voices had a calming effect on captive wildlife. Nanook's massive head tracked David's movements as he approached the feeding mechanism. The system was designed with multiple safety protocols. The keeper remained outside the habitat while food was delivered through secure openings that could only be operated from the exterior. David had performed this routine hundreds of times, but today something felt different. As David activated the feeding system, Nanook moved with unusual speed to intercept the food. Instead of his typical approach, a measured walk followed by careful investigation of the offerings, the bear lunged forward the moment the mechanism engaged. His timing was so precise that David wondered if the bear had somehow learned to anticipate the system's operation. "That's new," David muttered, making a mental note to mention it to Elena when she returned from whatever meeting she was in. Siku's behavior was equally strange. Instead of waiting for Nanook to finish before approaching the food, as was her usual pattern, she positioned herself at the secondary feeding station simultaneously. The two bears were feeding in perfect synchronization, something David had never observed before. David's radio crackled to life. "David, this is Harrison. How are things going with the morning feeding?" "Feeding's complete," David responded. "Bears seem a bit more coordinated than usual. Elena might want to know about it." There was a pause before Harrison replied. "Elena won't be returning to the habitat today. Dr. Foster is conducting some evaluations." David felt a stab of concern. Elena had been acting strangely lately, arriving earlier and earlier, staying later, and filling notebook after notebook with observations that seemed increasingly detailed and urgent. "Is she all right?" "We're taking care of it," Harrison said. "Can you handle the Arctic section alone today?" "Sure," David said, though he felt less confident than he sounded. Elena's expertise with the polar bears was legendary among the staff. She could read their moods, predict their behaviors, and had never had a safety incident in 8 years. David respected the bears, but he didn't have Elena's instinctive understanding of their psychology. As David finished securing the feeding area, he noticed that both bears had returned to positions near the keeper entrance. They sat motionless, watching the door through which David would need to enter if any maintenance or enrichment activities were required inside the habitat. Their positioning reminded David of sentries, and for a moment he understood why Elena had been so concerned. In Foster's office, Elena was becoming increasingly agitated as the morning progressed. "You don't understand," she repeated for the 12th time. "Everyone thinks I'm imagining things, but I have documentation." Weeks of careful observation. Foster had been reviewing Elena's personnel file while Elena spoke. Elena Cruz had been an exemplary employee since her hiring 8 years ago. She held a bachelor's degree in zoology from Michigan State University and had completed specialized training in large carnivore management at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. Her performance reviews were consistently excellent, and she had received commendations for her innovative enrichment programs and her ability to work safely with dangerous animals. "Elena, your work record is impeccable," Foster said. "That's why your current state is so concerning. Something has changed, and I want to help you figure out what it is." "What's changed is that I finally started paying attention," Elena said. "Really paying attention, not just going through the motions of feeding and cleaning and enrichment activities. I started watching them the way they watch us." Elena pulled out her phone and scrolled through dozens of photos and videos she'd taken of the bears over the past month. "Look at this," she said, showing Foster a video of Nanook near the habitat's artificial cave structure. "This was taken last Tuesday at 2:17 p.m. Now look at this one from Thursday at 2:19 p.m. The videos showed Nanook in similar positions near the cave, but Foster couldn't discern any meaningful pattern." "Eleanor, what am I supposed to be seeing?" "The positioning is identical, not similar, identical. Down to the angle of his head and the placement of his paws. He's rehearsing, Dr. Foster, practicing a specific position for a specific purpose." Foster continued watching the videos, seeing nothing more than a bear exploring its environment in the way bears naturally did. But Elena's conviction was absolute, and that certainty in the face of what appeared to be misinterpreted animal behavior was deeply concerning. "Elena, I want you to consider taking a leave of absence, just for a few weeks to rest and gain some perspective." Elena stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair. "A leave of absence? While they're preparing to make their move? Dr. Foster, you're asking me to abandon my post at the most critical moment." "What move, Elena?" "What exactly do you think the bears are planning?" Elena stared at Foster, as if the answer should be obvious. "They're planning to kill someone." The bluntness of Elena's statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Foster had dealt with many cases of workplace stress and paranoia, but she'd never encountered such a specific, articulated delusion focused on animal behavior. "Elena, polar bears in captivity don't plan attacks on humans. They're fed regularly, their needs are met, and they're habituated to human presence. The safety protocols we have in place have been tested and refined over decades. Safety protocols are only effective if the animals follow the behavioral assumptions those protocols are based on," Elena said, her voice gaining a lecturing quality. "Our safety measures assume that polar bears will behave like typical captive animals, reactive rather than proactive, responding to immediate stimuli rather than planning for future opportunities. But what if those assumptions are wrong?" Elena opened her notebook to a page covered with diagrams and calculations. "I've mapped their movement patterns against our staff schedules. There are 12 daily opportunities when keepers enter the habitat, either for feeding, cleaning, or enrichment activities. Of those 12 opportunities, 7 involve single keeper entry. Of those 7, 3 occur during periods when visitor traffic is highest, meaning maximum witnesses and maximum chaos if something were to go wrong." Foster studied the diagrams, which were surprisingly sophisticated. Elena had created detailed floor plans of the polar bear habitat, marked with timing charts and probability calculations that demonstrated genuine analytical thinking, even if applied to an irrational premise. "Elena, this level of analysis suggests you've been thinking about this constantly. When do you sleep? When do you eat? When do you engage in activities unrelated to the bears?" Elena looked confused by the questions. Sleep isn't important. Food isn't important. The only thing that matters is understanding what they're planning before it's too late. Dr. Foster recognized the signs of a complete fixation that had consumed Elena's life. The paranoid ideation had become so central to her existence that normal human needs were being ignored in service of the delusion. Back at the polar bear habitat, David was growing increasingly uncomfortable with his solo assignment. Without Elena's confident presence, the bears seemed more imposing, more unpredictable. As he prepared for the midday enrichment activity, introducing new scents and objects to stimulate the bears' natural investigative behaviors, he found himself hyper-aware of their positioning and movements. The enrichment protocol required David to enter a small section of the habitat while the bears were secured in a separate area. Multiple barriers and safety systems ensured that human-animal contact was impossible during these activities. But David couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched and evaluated as he placed new objects around the habitat, logs soaked in different scents, hidden food rewards, puzzle toys designed to challenge the bear's problem-solving abilities. David noticed that Nanook was indeed tracking his every movement from behind the safety barrier. The bear's attention was so focused that it seemed almost human in its intensity. "Just curious, right?" David said aloud, trying to convince himself. Nothing wrong with curiosity. But when David moved to a new area of the habitat, Nanook immediately repositioned himself to maintain visual contact. The bear's movements were fluid and purposeful, giving David the unsettling impression that Nanook was taking notes on his activities. Dr. Rodriguez decided to personally observe the bears after hearing Foster's preliminary assessment of Elena's condition. As director, Rodriguez felt responsible for both her staff's well-being and the safety of the animals under her care. If Elena's paranoia was based on actual behavioral changes in the bears, Rodriguez needed to understand what might be causing those changes. Rodriguez positioned herself at the main viewing area and began her own observations. Nanook and Siku were engaged in typical post-feeding behaviors. Nanook was investigating the new enrichment objects David had placed, while Siku was grooming herself near the pool. Their behaviors appeared completely normal to Rodriguez's experienced eye. But as Rodriguez watched longer, she began to notice subtleties that gave her pause. When visitors approached the viewing glass, the bear's responses were remarkably consistent. Nanook would position himself where his full size was most visible, while Siku would engage in swimming behaviors that attracted attention. The coordination wasn't obvious, but it was present. "Interesting," Rodriguez murmured, pulling out her own notebook to document what she was seeing. Dr. Thompson joined Rodriguez at the viewing area. "Any unusual behaviors?" "Define unusual," Rodriguez replied. "They're certainly aware of human presence in ways that suggest higher cognition than we typically attribute to them." Thompson nodded. "That's actually normal for polar bears. They're incredibly intelligent animals. In the wild, they have to solve complex problems related to hunting, navigation, and survival. Captivity doesn't diminish that intelligence, it just redirects it. But Elena seems to think their intelligence has taken on a threatening quality." "Elena's been under enormous pressure," Thompson said. "She's the senior keeper for our most dangerous animals. She works longer hours than anyone else in the department, and she's taken personal responsibility for every aspect of their care. That level of stress can manifest in many ways." Rodriguez continued watching the bears. "What's your professional opinion about their current behavioral state?" Thompson considered carefully. "From a behavioral standpoint, they're exhibiting normal captive polar bear behaviors. They're alert, engaged with their environment, responsive to stimuli, and maintaining good physical condition. If Elena weren't having these concerns, I would describe them as model zoo animals." "And Elena's concerns?" "Elena's concerns reflect a textbook case of hypervigilance combined with paranoid ideation. She's seeing threats where none exist, but her observations are based on real behaviors that she's misinterpreting through the lens of her anxiety." Rodriguez felt relief at Thompson's assessment, but she couldn't entirely shake her own unease. The bears did seem particularly alert today, and their coordination, while probably coincidental, was noticeable enough to catch her attention. In the zoo's medical office, Dr. Webb was reviewing Elena's recent health records. As the staff veterinarian, Webb was also responsible for employee health monitoring, particularly for staff who worked with dangerous animals. Elena's records showed no red flags, her vaccinations were current, her physical fitness evaluations were excellent, and she'd never reported any injuries or health concerns. But Webb's informal observations over the past month painted a different picture. Elena had lost weight, Her skin had a pale, drawn quality that suggested poor nutrition and lack of sleep, and her usual energetic demeanor had been replaced by a tense hypervigilance that made conversations with her uncomfortable. Webb called Foster's office. "How's Elena responding to intervention?" "She's coherent and articulate, but completely convinced that the bears represent an imminent threat," Foster replied. "Her delusion is sophisticated and internally consistent. She's not hallucinating or experiencing obvious breaks from reality. She's just interpreting real observations through a paranoid framework." Prognosis? Without intervention, this will likely escalate. She's already sacrificing sleep, nutrition, and social relationships to monitor the bears. The obsession is consuming her life. Webb looked out his window toward the Arctic habitat, where a small crowd of visitors was gathering for the day's first public viewing. The Detroit Zoo was known for its excellent polar bear program, and the viewing area was always popular, especially during feeding times. "What's our protocol if she refuses treatment?" "We'll have to place her on administrative leave and potentially involve mental health authorities if she becomes a danger to herself or others," Foster said. "But I'm hoping we can convince her to seek help voluntarily." At 11 a.m., the zoo opened to the public, and visitors began arriving at the polar bear habitat. The first groups were typically families with young children, school groups, and wildlife enthusiasts who appreciated the early morning activity levels of the animals. Margaret Henderson, a retired teacher in her 60s, was among the first visitors to reach the polar bear viewing area. She'd been coming to the Detroit Zoo for over 30 years and had watched Nanook grow from a cub to his current magnificent size. Henderson often spent hours at various exhibits, sketching animals and taking notes for the nature journal she'd kept since retirement. "Magnificent creatures," Henderson said to the family standing next to her at the glass. The family, parents Tom and Lisa Parker with their 2 teenage children, Jake and Emma, were visiting Detroit from Ohio. They'd specifically planned their trip to coincide with the polar bear feeding demonstration scheduled for 11:30 a.m. "How big do they get?" Jake asked Henderson, who seemed knowledgeable about the animals. "The male can weigh up to 1,200 pounds, Henderson replied. "They're the largest land carnivores in the world." As the group watched, Nanook emerged from the artificial cave and approached the viewing glass. His movement was deliberate and confident, and when he reached the barrier, he positioned himself directly in front of the gathered visitors. The size difference between the bear and the humans was dramatic. Even behind the protective glass, Nanook's presence was overwhelming. "He's beautiful," Lisa Parker said, raising her camera to take photos. Nanook seemed to pose for the pictures, turning his massive head to present his profile, then looking directly at the camera with an expression that appeared almost knowing. The family laughed at what they interpreted as the bear's cooperation with their photography session. Henderson, however, noticed something that made her uncomfortable. Nanook's attention wasn't general, it was specific. The bear's gaze would focus on individual visitors, lingering for several seconds on each person as if memorizing their faces. When children approached the glass, Nanook would lower his head to their eye level, maintaining steady eye contact that went beyond casual interest. "He's very people-oriented," Henderson observed. "Is that normal?" Tom Parker asked. Henderson had been visiting zoos her entire life, and she'd never seen an animal maintain such focused, sustained attention on human visitors. Most animals would acknowledge crowds briefly before returning to their own activities. Nanook's behavior suggested a level of interest that bordered on fixation. David Kim arrived for the 11:30 feeding demonstration, wheeling a cart containing the bear's midday meal. A small crowd of about 30 visitors had gathered in anticipation of the scheduled activity. David had performed feeding demonstrations hundreds of times, but today his nervousness was obvious to anyone paying attention. "Good morning, everyone," David announced through the microphone connected to the habitat's educational system. "I'm David, and I'll be presenting today's polar bear feeding demonstration." As David began his prepared educational presentation about polar bear biology and conservation, both Nanook and Siku moved to positions that gave them optimal viewing angles of the gathered crowd. Their coordination was subtle but unmistakable. As David spoke about hunting behaviors in the wild, the bears arranged themselves as if they were indeed hunting, with the crowd as their prey. "Polar bears are incredibly intelligent animals," David continued, following his script. "They're capable of complex problem-solving and can adapt their strategies based on changing conditions." Nanook chose that moment to rear up on his hind legs, displaying his full 12-foot height to the crowd. The movement was dramatic and perfectly timed, occurring exactly when David mentioned problem-solving abilities. The crowd gasped and applauded, interpreting the display as entertaining rather than threatening. But Margaret Henderson noticed that Nanook's positioning allowed him to see over the safety barriers into areas normally hidden from the bear's view. From his elevated position, the bear could observe the keeper work areas, the security checkpoints, and the pathways used by staff to access the habitat. "That's quite a view he has from up there," Henderson said to no one in particular. David concluded the feeding demonstration and began wheeling his cart away from the exhibit. As he did, both bears moved to follow his departure, tracking him until he disappeared from their line of sight. The behavior struck several visitors as unusually attentive, but most interpreted it as affection for their caretaker rather than something more sinister. In Foster's office, Elena's condition was deteriorating as the morning progressed. Separation from the bears was clearly causing her significant distress, and her paranoid ideation was becoming more elaborate and urgent. "I need to get back to them," Elena said, standing and pacing to the window. "Every minute I'm away, they're learning more about our routines, our weaknesses." "Elena, sit down. Let's talk about what's really happening here." Elena spun around, her eyes wide with frustration. "What's really happening is that everyone is ignoring a serious safety threat because it doesn't fit with our comfortable assumptions about captive animals." Foster tried a different approach. "Help me understand your theory. If the bears are planning something, what's their endgame? What do you think they want to achieve?" Elena sat back down, leaning forward intently. "They want to assert dominance, to remind us that we're not the apex predators in this relationship. The barriers give us an illusion of control, but they also create a false sense of security that makes us vulnerable." Vulnerable to what? To the moment when the barriers fail or when we make a mistake. Nanook and Siku are intelligent enough to recognize that moment will come eventually, and they're preparing for it. Foster made more notes, recognizing that Elena's delusion had a logical structure that made it resistant to simple contradiction. Elena wasn't hallucinating or experiencing obvious cognitive distortions. She was applying sophisticated analysis to real observations, but through a filter of paranoid interpretation. "Elena, let's consider an alternative explanation. Is it possible that your own stress and hypervigilance are causing you to see patterns that aren't actually meaningful?" Eleanor's expression hardened. "Dr. Foster, I've worked with these animals for 8 years. I know the difference between normal behavior and aberrant behavior. What I'm documenting now is completely outside the range of anything I've previously observed." "But is it outside the range of normal polar bear behavior in general?" Elena paused, considering the question more carefully than she had considered anything else that morning. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "But that's exactly why we can't ignore it. We're dealing with apex predators whose cognitive capabilities may exceed our understanding." At noon, Rodriguez made the decision to temporarily close the polar bear exhibit to public viewing while the staff situation was resolved. The announcement cited routine maintenance, but several visitors who had been observing the bears earlier in the day were disappointed to miss their return visit. Margaret Henderson, who had planned to spend her entire afternoon at the zoo, asked one of the staff members about the closure. "Is everything all right with the animals?" "Just routine maintenance," the staff member replied. But Henderson noticed that several officials were gathered near the exhibit, including people who didn't appear to be regular zoo employees. Dr. Patricia Williams, a consulting psychiatrist who specialized in workplace mental health crises, arrived at the zoo shortly after lunch. Williams had been called in by Foster to provide a professional assessment of Elena's condition and to recommend appropriate intervention strategies. Williams was a woman in her early 50s with extensive experience in stress-related psychological disorders. She had worked with emergency responders, military personnel, and others in high-stress occupations who developed paranoid ideation as a response to chronic pressure. "Dr. Foster, I've reviewed your notes," Williams said. "This appears to be a case of acute paranoid ideation, possibly triggered by chronic stress and sleep deprivation. The focus on the bears suggests that Elena's work environment has become the center of her anxiety. What's the appropriate intervention?" "Immediate removal from the stressor, in this case, contact with the bears, combined with psychiatric evaluation and potential medication. If she's willing to cooperate, we can handle this as an outpatient situation. If not, we may need to consider involuntary commitment for evaluation." Foster felt the weight of the decision. Elena had been a valued employee and colleague for 8 years, and the thought of having her forcibly removed from her workplace felt like a betrayal. But the alternative, allowing her to continue in her current psychological state, posed risks to both Elena and potentially to public safety. "Let me try talking to her one more time," Foster said. When Foster returned to her office, Elena was standing at the window, staring toward the Arctic habitat, despite the fact that the exhibit was no longer visible from that angle. "Elena, we need to talk about getting you some help." Elena didn't turn around. "They know I'm not there. They know their primary observer has been removed. This is exactly what they've been waiting for." "Elena, I want you to listen to me carefully. Your observations about the bears may be accurate, but your interpretation of those observations is being influenced by stress and exhaustion. We want to help you get perspective on this situation." Elena finally turned around, and Foster was shocked by the change in her appearance. In just a few hours, Elena seemed to have aged years. Her skin was pale and drawn, her eyes were rimmed with red, and her hands were shaking slightly. "Doctor, Foster, I appreciate your concern, but you don't understand the urgency of the situation. Every moment we waste discussing my mental state is a moment that Nanook and Siku are using to finalize their preparations." "Preparations for what, specifically?" Elena sat down heavily, as if the weight of her knowledge was physically exhausting. "They're going to create an opportunity. I don't know how, and I don't know exactly when, but they're going to engineer a situation where they have access to human prey." Foster felt a chill at Elena's use of the word prey to describe zoo staff or visitors. The dehumanization implicit in that terminology suggested that Elena's paranoia had reached a dangerous level. "Elena, I need you to come with me to get a medical evaluation, just to rule out any physical causes for how you've been feeling." Elena stood up abruptly. "I'm not leaving this building while those animals are unsupervised by someone who understands them." "David is supervising them. He's a qualified keeper." "David doesn't see what I see. He doesn't understand their psychology the way I do. If something happens while I'm gone, it will be my fault for abandoning my post." Foster realized that Elena's sense of responsibility had become pathological. Elena believed that she was the only thing standing between the bears and some catastrophic event, and that belief had become the center of her identity. Dr. Williams entered Foster's office, accompanied by Harrison and Rodriguez. Elena looked at the group and immediately understood that a decision had been made about her future. "You're removing me," Elena said flatly. "We're getting you help," Rodriguez corrected. "Elena, you're a valued member of our team, but you need professional support right now." Elena's composure finally cracked. "You're making a mistake. You're all making a terrible mistake. Those bears are not normal captive animals anymore. Something has changed in their psychology, and I'm the only one who's been paying attention." Williams stepped forward. "Elena, I'm Doctor Williams. I'm here to help you work through what you've been experiencing." Elena looked at Williams with a mixture of desperation and anger. "Another expert who's going to tell me that I'm imagining things. Tell me, Doctor Williams, how many hours have you spent observing polar bear behavior? How many days have you dedicated to understanding their psychology?" "I specialize in human psychology, Elena, and I can see that you're under tremendous stress." "Of course I'm under stress," Elena shouted. "I'm trying to prevent a catastrophe while everyone around me pretends that 1,200 pounds of apex predator can be controlled by glass and good intentions." Harrison made the decision to call security, not to restrain Elena, but to ensure that the situation didn't escalate further. Elena noticed the call and seemed to deflate, as if she finally understood that her warnings weren't going to be heeded. "Fine," Elena said quietly. "Remove me from my post. Ignore everything I've documented. But when something happens, and something will happen, remember that I tried to warn you." Elena gathered her belongings, including the notebook that contained weeks of detailed observations. As she was escorted from the building, she looked back toward the Arctic habitat one last time. Even from a distance, she could see Nanook's massive form near the viewing glass, and she was convinced that he was watching her departure. With Elena gone, the zoo's operations returned to a semblance of normalcy. David took over primary care responsibilities for the polar bears, assisted by Jennifer Walsh, a keeper from the African mammals section who had some experience with large carnivores. Walsh was a competent professional in her early 30s, but she lacked the specialized knowledge that Eleanor had developed over 8 years of working exclusively with Arctic species. "Any special protocols I should know about?" Walsh asked David as they prepared for the afternoon feeding. David hesitated, remembering Eleanor's recent concerns and his own morning observations. Eleanor thought they were acting strangely lately, more coordinated than usual, but Dr. Thompson thinks it's within normal parameters. Walsh nodded, but she found herself studying the bears more carefully than she normally would. Nanook was positioned near the keeper entrance, seemingly relaxed but clearly alert. Siku was in the pool, but her swimming pattern allowed her to surface regularly and observe the staff area. "They do seem pretty focused on us," Walsh observed. "Yeah, Elena mentioned that. But they've always been people-oriented. It's part of what makes them good educational animals." As the afternoon progressed, visitor traffic increased significantly. The polar bear habitat was always one of the zoo's most popular attractions, and weekends brought large crowds eager to see the magnificent Arctic predators. The viewing area could accommodate up to 200 people comfortably, and by 2 p.m. it was approaching capacity. Carlos Mendez, a freelance photographer who specialized in wildlife photography, was among the afternoon visitors. Mendez had been documenting zoo animals for a photography project about captive wildlife, and the Detroit Zoo's polar bears were considered exceptional subjects due to their size and the habitat's design. As Mendez set up his camera equipment, he noticed that both bears seemed particularly photogenic today. They positioned themselves in areas with optimal lighting, displayed behaviors that created dramatic compositions, and maintained poses long enough for careful photography. Their cooperation was so consistent that Mendez wondered if they'd been trained for photo sessions. "They're natural models," Mendez said to a nearby visitor. Dr. Robert Chase, a visiting zoologist from the University of Michigan, was conducting research on captive animal behaviors as part of a larger study on zoo design and animal welfare. Chase was observing several exhibits throughout the day, but the polar bear habitat was his primary focus due to its reputation as an exemplary enclosure. Chase's trained eye picked up details that casual visitors missed. The bears' movements were indeed highly coordinated, their positioning was strategically optimal for observing human activity, and their attention to visitors was unusually sustained. While none of these behaviors were abnormal in isolation, their combination was noteworthy. "Interesting," Chase muttered, making detailed notes in his research journal. Sarah Martinez, who had worked the early morning shift, returned for the afternoon feeding demonstration. She'd been thinking about Elena's behavior all day, and she wanted to observe the bears herself to see if there was any validity to Elena's concerns. As Sarah prepared for the 3 p.m. feeding, she found herself moving more cautiously than usual. Elena's paranoia had been contagious, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being evaluated by predators who understood more about her routines than she was comfortable with. The feeding demonstration proceeded normally, with Sarah providing educational commentary to the gathered crowd while delivering the bears' afternoon meal. But as she spoke about polar bear hunting strategies in the wild, Sarah began to notice details that she'd previously overlooked. When she mentioned that polar bears could smell prey from over a mile away, Nanook stopped eating and looked directly at her through the glass. When she explained that polar bears were patient hunters who could wait motionless for hours for the right opportunity, Siku moved to a position where she could observe both Sarah and the crowd simultaneously. These behavioral adaptations make polar bears incredibly effective predators in their natural environment, Sarah continued, but her voice wavered slightly as she noticed how intently both bears were listening to her words. Dr. Chase approached Sarah after the demonstration. "Excuse me, I'm Dr. Chase from the University of Michigan. I'm conducting research on captive animal behaviors, and I wanted to ask about the coordination I've been observing between your bears." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that someone else had noticed the coordination, anxiety about what it might mean. "You've noticed it too. Their movements are remarkably synchronized for animals that aren't actively engaged in social behaviors. Is this typical for them?" Sarah considered how to answer. "Our senior keeper has been documenting some unusual patterns recently, but she's not available to discuss them right now." Chase raised an eyebrow. "Unusual patterns?" Enhanced situational awareness, coordinated positioning, sustained attention to human activity beyond normal curiosity levels. Chase made notes rapidly. "How long have these behaviors been observed?" "About 6 weeks, according to Elena, our senior keeper." "And the other staff? Have they noticed these changes?" Sarah looked around, making sure they weren't being overheard by visitors. Elena was the primary observer. The rest of us have been skeptical of her interpretations. Chase nodded thoughtfully. "In my experience, experienced keepers often notice behavioral changes before they become obvious to others. Their interpretations may be influenced by their emotional investment in the animals, but their observations are usually accurate." Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. If Dr. Chase, an objective outsider with academic credentials, was validating Elena's observations, what did that mean for Elena's interpretations? As the afternoon progressed, more staff members began to notice the behaviors that Elena had been documenting. The bears' attention to human activity was indeed unusually focused. Their coordination was more pronounced than typical captive animal behavior, and their positioning seemed strategically optimal for observing zoo operations. Kevin Sullivan, who had initially dismissed Elena's concerns, found himself increasingly uncomfortable during his routine maintenance activities. As he cleaned the viewing glass, both bears positioned themselves to watch his work with an intensity that made him feel like he was being studied rather than simply observed. "They're really watching me today," Kevin mentioned to David during a brief conversation. "Yeah, they've been like that all week. Elena thought it was significant." Kevin paused in his cleaning. Maybe Elena was onto something. By 4 p.m., word of Elena's removal and the unusual animal behaviors had spread through the zoo's staff network. While official reports maintained that Elena had been placed on administrative leave for personal reasons, unofficial conversations revealed the true nature of her concerns and her mental state. Dr. Thompson received multiple reports throughout the afternoon from various staff members who had noticed the bears' heightened attention to human activity. While each individual report could be explained as normal animal behavior, the accumulation of observations was beginning to paint a picture that made Thompson reconsider her initial dismissal of Elena's concerns. Thompson called Rodriguez. "Michelle, I think we need to discuss the polar bear situation." "What's the current status?" "Multiple staff members are reporting the same behavioral patterns that Elena documented. Enhanced attention to humans, coordinated movement patterns, strategic positioning for optimal observation." Rodriguez felt her stomach tighten. "Your assessment?" "The behaviors themselves aren't necessarily threatening, but they do suggest a level of environmental awareness and human-focused attention that's beyond typical captive animal parameters." "Meaning?" "Meaning Elena's observations may have been accurate, even if her interpretations were influenced by paranoid ideation." Rodriguez made a decision that she hoped she wouldn't regret. "Close the exhibit. Immediately. Site technical maintenance and keep visitors away until we can fully assess the situation." The announcement that the polar bear exhibit was temporarily closed disappointed many visitors, but it also allowed the staff to observe the animals without the pressure of public demonstration. What they saw during the next several hours would change their understanding of everything Elena had tried to tell them. Without visitors present, Nanook and Siku's behavior changed dramatically. Instead of their usual captive animal activities, swimming, exploring enrichment objects, resting, they began what could only be described as systematic exploration of their habitat's boundaries. David watched in growing alarm as Nanook methodically tested every section of the barrier system. The bear would push against glass panels, investigate the seams where different materials met, and examine the mechanical systems that controlled water flow and temperature. His investigation was thorough, systematic, and purposeful. Siku, meanwhile, had begun investigating areas of the habitat that were normally hidden from public view. She explored drainage systems, examined the foundations of artificial structures, and tested the integrity of barriers that separated the main habitat from secondary areas. "They're conducting reconnaissance," David said aloud, finally understanding what Elena had been trying to tell them. Dr. Thompson arrived to observe the bears' behavior firsthand. Within minutes of watching their systematic exploration, she realized that Elena's concerns had been based on genuine observations of genuinely unusual animal behavior. "This is not normal captive behavior," Thompson said grimly. "This level of environmental analysis suggests cognitive engagement that goes far beyond typical animal curiosity." Rodriguez joined the observation, and what she saw made her deeply uncomfortable. The bears were working together to investigate their containment system with a thoroughness that suggested they understood the purpose of the barriers and were looking for weaknesses. "How long have they been doing this?" Rodriguez asked. Probably for weeks, Thompson replied. But Elena was the only one who was here early enough and consistently enough to observe it. Their behavior during public hours has been normal because they've learned to modify their activities based on human presence. The implication was staggering. Nanook and Siku had developed sophisticated behavioral adaptations that allowed them to investigate their containment when they believed they were unobserved, while maintaining normal appearances during public hours. The level of cognitive sophistication required for such deception was far beyond what anyone had attributed to captive polar bears. Webb arrived with tranquilizer equipment as a precautionary measure. If they're actively testing the barriers, we need to sedate them until we can assess the integrity of the containment system. Agreed, Rodriguez said. But we need to be strategic about it. If they're as intelligent as they appear to be, they'll recognize the threat posed by tranquilizer equipment. As if responding to their conversation, both bears immediately moved away from the barriers and positioned themselves in the center of the habitat, as far from the staff area as possible. Their movement was so immediate and coordinated that it suggested they had been monitoring the human conversation and understood its implications. "They know," David said in amazement. "They actually understand what we're discussing." Thompson was taking rapid notes, documenting behavior that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal cognition. This level of situational awareness and strategic thinking is unprecedented in my experience with captive animals. The tranquilization attempt proved to be more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Nanook and Siku refused to approach the areas where darting would be possible, and they maintained positions that made accurate targeting difficult. Their evasive behaviors were sophisticated and coordinated, suggesting that they understood the purpose of the tranquilizer equipment. "They're not just avoiding us," Webb observed. "They're actively countering our attempts to sedate them." After 2 hours of unsuccessful tranquilization attempts, Rodriguez made the decision to bring in external expertise. Dr. Jonathan Miller, one of the country's leading experts on polar bear behavior, was contacted and agreed to travel from his research facility in Alaska to assess the situation. Miller arrived at the zoo that evening, accompanied by specialized equipment for observing and potentially containing dangerous animals. His reputation for understanding polar bear psychology was unmatched, and his assessment would determine how the zoo proceeded. Miller's initial observation of Nanook and Siku lasted over an hour, during which he documented behaviors that aligned with Elena's reports, but exceeded even her detailed descriptions. The bears demonstrated environmental awareness, strategic thinking, and cooperative behaviors that challenged established understanding of captive animal cognition. These animals have developed cognitive adaptations beyond typical captive behavior, Miller concluded. Their intelligence level and cooperative abilities suggest they may indeed pose a security risk. Rodriguez felt vindicated in her decision to take Elena's concerns seriously, but she also felt deep regret for not acting sooner. What's our next step? Complete containment reassessment, behavioral intervention through environmental modification, and potentially relocation to a more secure facility, Miller replied. But first, we need to ensure that current containment is adequate for animals of this intelligence level. The evening hours brought a series of discoveries that would change everything about how the zoo operated. Engineers examining the polar bear habitat found evidence that the bears had been systematically testing the structural integrity of their containment. Scratches on the glass panels suggested repeated pressure testing. Wear patterns on barrier seams indicated prolonged investigation, and the positioning of environmental features had been altered in ways that optimized the bear's ability to observe human activities. "They've been modifying their environment," the lead engineer reported, "moving objects to create better sight lines, clearing areas that improve their mobility, positioning obstacles that would provide cover if they needed to hide from tranquilizer attempts." Rodriguez stared at the evidence of the bear's intelligence and planning capabilities. Elena had been right about everything: the systematic observation, the coordinated behaviors, the strategic thinking. But Elena's mental health had deteriorated to the point where her accurate warnings had been dismissed as paranoid delusions. "We need to contact Elena," Rodriguez said. "She deserves to know that her observations were correct." Foster shook her head. "Elena's been admitted for psychiatric evaluation. Her paranoid ideation has progressed to the point where vindication might actually worsen her condition rather than improve it." The irony was profound and tragic. Elena's expertise and observational skills had identified a genuine security concern, but the stress of that discovery had triggered a psychological breakdown that prevented her from effectively communicating the threat to her colleagues. Dr. Miller spent the night designing a comprehensive behavior modification program aimed at reducing the bear's focus on human activity and environmental manipulation. The program would involve significant changes to their daily routines, their habitat configuration, and their interaction with staff. The goal is to redirect their intelligence towards species-appropriate activities rather than environmental analysis and human observation, Miller explained to the assembled staff. "But we're dealing with animals whose cognitive abilities may exceed our current understanding of polar bear psychology." The next morning, the zoo implemented Miller's behavioral intervention protocols. The bears' feeding schedules were randomized to prevent them from predicting staff movements. Their enrichment activities were redesigned to focus their attention inward rather than outward, and their habitat was modified to reduce sightlines into staff areas. Nanook and Siku's response to these changes was immediate and telling. They became agitated, pacing restlessly, and frequently positioning themselves at the viewing barriers in apparent attempts to re-establish their observation routines. Their distress at the loss of their surveillance capabilities confirmed that Elena's interpretations had been accurate. Sarah Martinez, now serving as the interim senior keeper, found herself thinking constantly about Elena's warnings. Watching the bears' frustrated responses to the environmental modifications, Sarah realized that Elena had identified a situation that could have become genuinely dangerous if left unaddressed. "Elena saw this coming weeks ago," Sarah said to David during their lunch break. "She tried to warn everyone, but the way she was communicating made it impossible to take her seriously." David nodded grimly. The stress of knowing something was wrong, but not being able to convince anyone, probably contributed to her breakdown. The psychological toll on Elena became clear when Foster visited her at the psychiatric facility where she was receiving treatment. Elena was calm and articulate, but her fixation on the bears remained central to her thoughts. "Have they implemented any security modifications?" Elena asked immediately when Foster arrived. "They've made some environmental changes based on Dr. Miller's recommendations," Foster replied carefully. Elena's face showed the first relief Foster had seen from her in weeks. So they finally listened. They finally understood that the situation was serious. Foster found herself in the difficult position of validating Elena's observations while trying to help her move beyond the paranoid framework that had consumed her life. "Your observations were accurate, Elena. But your interpretation of those observations was influenced by stress and sleep deprivation. My interpretations were based on 8 years of experience and weeks of careful documentation," Elena replied. "The fact that everyone finally took action proves that I was right to be concerned." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Foster trying to help Elena understand the difference between accurate observation and paranoid interpretation. Elena's mind had created a sophisticated theoretical framework that explained the bear's behaviors in terms of deliberate threat. But the same behaviors could be understood as natural intelligence responding to an enriched environment. Over the following weeks, the bears' behavior gradually normalized under the new protocols. Their attention to human activity decreased, their coordination became less pronounced, and their investigation of habitat boundaries stopped entirely. The behavioral modifications had successfully redirected their intelligence towards species-appropriate activities, but the incident had profound implications for zoo operations beyond the immediate crisis. Staff training was enhanced to include recognition of unusual animal behaviors and protocols for reporting concerns without fear of dismissal. Mental health resources were expanded to support employees who worked with dangerous animals under stressful conditions. Elena's recovery was slow and complicated. Her paranoid ideation decreased with medication and therapy, but her passion for working with animals had been fundamentally altered by the experience. The bears that had once been the center of her professional life had become sources of anxiety that she couldn't overcome. "I still believe they were planning something," Eleanor told Dr. Williams during a therapy session 6 weeks after her hospitalization. "But I also understand that my response to that belief was disproportionate and unhealthy." Williams worked with Elena to develop coping strategies that would allow her to work with animals again without becoming consumed by hypervigilance and paranoid interpretation. The process was challenging because Elena's observational skills were genuinely exceptional. The goal was to maintain her expertise while preventing it from becoming pathological. Dr. Miller's final report on the Detroit Zoo incident became a landmark document in the field of captive animal behavior. His analysis of Nanook and Siku's cognitive capabilities challenged conventional understanding of polar bear intelligence and led to significant changes in how zoos around the country approached containment protocols for large, intelligent predators. The Detroit incident demonstrates that highly intelligent captive animals may develop behavioral adaptations that exceed our predictive models, Miller wrote. Facilities housing apex predators should assume that these animals possess cognitive capabilities at the upper range of their species' potential and design containment and management protocols accordingly. The incident also became a case study in occupational psychology, highlighting how expertise and dedication could become pathological under sufficient stress. Elena's story was used in training programs for zoo professionals, emphasizing the importance of mental health support for employees who worked with dangerous animals. Margaret Henderson, the retired teacher who had observed the bear's unusual attention to visitors, continued visiting the zoo regularly. She noticed the environmental modifications and the changes in the bear's behaviors, and she often wondered about the zookeeper who had been removed so abruptly. Henderson's natural curiosity led her to research the incident, and she eventually learned about Elena's concerns and subsequent breakdown. "It's tragic," Henderson said to her neighbor, who also enjoyed visiting the zoo. She saw something real, but the stress of seeing it broke her down before she could effectively communicate the danger. The media attention surrounding the incident was minimal, carefully managed by the zoo's public relations department to avoid creating panic about zoo safety while acknowledging that improvements had been made to animal management protocols. The story that emerged in local newspapers focused on the zoo's commitment to continuous improvement and enhanced safety measures rather than the specific details of Elena's paranoid concerns. Carlos Mendez, the photographer who had documented the bear's unusual behaviors, found that his images from that February day told a story he hadn't understood while taking them. In retrospect, the bear's positioning and attention patterns were clearly different from typical captive animal photography. His images became part of Dr. Miller's research documentation, providing visual evidence of the cognitive behaviors that Eleanor had tried so desperately to communicate. Dr. Chase's research expanded to include a broader analysis of unusual behaviors in captive apex predators. His preliminary findings suggested that the Detroit incident wasn't unique. Other facilities had documented similar patterns of enhanced environmental awareness and strategic behavior in highly intelligent predators. But these observations had often been dismissed or misinterpreted. We may need to fundamentally reconsider our assumptions about the cognitive capabilities of captive apex predators, Chase wrote in his initial research paper. The traditional model of animal behavior may be inadequate for understanding the psychological adaptations that develop in highly intelligent species housed in complex, enriched environments. Elena's colleagues struggled with guilt about their dismissal of her concerns. Sarah Martinez, in particular, felt responsible for not supporting Elena during her crisis. "I should have listened more carefully," Sarah confided to David. "Elena was trying to protect everyone, and we treated her like she was losing her mind." David nodded, sharing Sarah's regret. The irony is that her breakdown was probably caused by the stress of knowing something was wrong, but not being able to convince anyone to take it seriously. Dr. Webb conducted a comprehensive review of Elena's medical records and work history, looking for early warning signs that might have been missed. Elena's dedication to her work had always been exceptional, but in retrospect, Webb could see a pattern of increasing stress and social isolation that had preceded her breakdown by several months. She was carrying too much responsibility, Webb concluded. Senior keepers for dangerous animals need better support systems and more regular psychological evaluations. The zoo implemented new protocols based on the lessons learned from Elena's situation. Staff working with apex predators would receive monthly psychological assessments, mandatory time off to prevent excessive attachment and stress accumulation, and training in recognizing and reporting unusual animal behaviors without fear of professional consequences. Jennifer Walsh, who had temporarily assisted with polar bear care during the crisis, requested permanent transfer to a different department. "I have tremendous respect for what Elena was doing," Walsh explained to Rodriguez, "but I don't have the psychological resilience required to work with animals of that intelligence level on a daily basis." Rodriguez understood Walsh's decision. Working with highly intelligent predators required a unique combination of expertise, intuition, and mental fortitude that not everyone possessed. Elena had excelled in that role for 8 years, but the cost had ultimately been her mental health. The polar bear habitat remained closed for 2 weeks while comprehensive safety assessments were conducted and environmental modifications were implemented. When it reopened to the public, visitors found a significantly altered space designed to limit the bear's ability to observe human activities while maintaining their quality of life. Nanook and Siku adapted to the changes with characteristic intelligence, but their behavior never returned to the patterns Elena had initially found so concerning. The environmental modifications had successfully interrupted their cognitive focus on human observation and containment analysis. Dr. Foster continued working with Elena through her recovery, helping her process the complex emotions surrounding her vindication and her breakdown. Elena's accurate observations had ultimately prevented a potentially dangerous situation, but the personal cost had been enormous. "I keep wondering what would have happened if I'd been wrong," Elena said during one therapy session. "If my paranoia had been just that. Paranoia with no basis in reality." "But you weren't wrong," Foster replied. "Your observations were accurate and your concerns were valid. The problem was that the stress of carrying that knowledge alone caused your psychological symptoms." Elena struggled with the knowledge that her breakdown had paradoxically proven necessary to get her colleagues to take the situation seriously. "I became the problem in order to solve the problem," she reflected. "My credibility had to be destroyed before anyone would investigate what I was reporting." The long-term implications of the Detroit Zoo incident extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Zoos across the country began reviewing their protocols for highly intelligent predators, implementing enhanced observation procedures and improved support systems for staff working with dangerous animals. Elena eventually returned to work, but in a different capacity. Her experience with Nanook and Siku had fundamentally changed her relationship with captive wildlife, and she found that she could no longer work directly with large predators without experiencing anxiety and hypervigilance. Instead, she transitioned to educational programming, where her expertise could be shared with visitors without the daily stress of direct animal care. "I still love them," Elena said about polar bears in general during a presentation to visiting students. "But I also understand now that loving something dangerous requires maintaining a healthy respect for that danger. The moment we become too comfortable with apex predators is the moment we put ourselves and them at risk." Dr. Miller's ongoing research into the cognitive capabilities of captive polar bears revealed that Nanook and Siku's behaviors were not unique. Other facilities housing intelligent predators in enriched environments had documented similar patterns of enhanced environmental awareness and human-focused observation. The difference was that most facilities lacked staff with Elena's combination of expertise and observational dedication. Elena Cruz may have been the first keeper to recognize and document this level of cognitive sophistication in captive polar bears, Miller wrote in his final report. Her experience demonstrates both the value of expert observation and the psychological risks faced by professionals who work closely with highly intelligent predators. The incident became a turning point in Elena's understanding of her own psychology as well as animal behavior. Through therapy, she learned to recognize the signs of stress and obsession that had contributed to her breakdown. She developed strategies for maintaining professional excellence without sacrificing her mental health. "The bears taught me something about myself," Elena reflected months later. "I have a tendency to become so focused on potential problems that I lose perspective on probability and proportion. Nanook and Siku were indeed behaving unusually, but my response to that unusual behavior was itself unusual and ultimately counterproductive." Sarah Martinez took over as senior keeper for the Arctic mammals, bringing a different approach to the role. Where Elena had been intensely focused and detail-oriented, Sarah emphasized teamwork and shared responsibility. The polar bears received excellent care, but no single individual carried the psychological burden of constantly monitoring their behavior. "Elena set an incredibly high standard," Sarah said. "But she also showed us the dangers of becoming too personally invested in animals that remain fundamentally wild, regardless of their captive environment." The bears themselves adapted to their new routines and modified environment. Their intelligence remained evident in their problem-solving abilities and their responses to enrichment activities. But their focus shifted away from human observation toward species-appropriate behaviors. Dr. Thompson continued studying Nanook and Siku as part of a broader research project on cognition in captive apex predators. Her findings supported Elena's observations about their intelligence while providing a framework for understanding those behaviors in terms of natural cognitive adaptations rather than threatening intentions. "Polar bears are among the most intelligent mammals on Earth," Thompson explained in her research publications. "In captive environments with adequate enrichment and stimulation, their cognitive abilities may develop in ways that surprise us. The challenge for zoos is to channel that intelligence toward positive behaviors while maintaining appropriate safety protocols." Elena's notebook, filled with weeks of detailed observations, became a valuable research document. Her documentation provided insights into polar bear cognition that would have been impossible to gather through traditional research methods. The irony that her breakdown had preserved the evidence of her discoveries was not lost on anyone involved in the incident. Elena's dedication to accurate observation, even as her mental health deteriorated, created a unique data set that advances our understanding of captive animal behavior, Dr. Chase wrote in his analysis of the incident. Her sacrifice, inadvertent though it was, has contributed significantly to improved safety protocols and animal management practices. The Detroit Zoo's handling of the crisis became a model for other facilities facing similar situations. The balance between taking staff concerns seriously and recognizing when those concerns reflected psychological distress rather than genuine threats required sophisticated judgment and comprehensive support systems. Rodriguez established new protocols requiring that any staff member reporting unusual animal behaviors be supported rather than dismissed, while also ensuring that psychological support was available for employees experiencing stress-related symptoms. The goal was to prevent future incidents where accurate observations were lost due to the psychological state of the observer. Elena's experience taught us that expertise and paranoia can coexist, Rodriguez explained during a conference presentation about the incident. Our job as administrators is to extract valuable information from distressed employees while providing appropriate support for their psychological needs. Elena's recovery continued over many months, with gradual improvement in her ability to maintain perspective on animal behaviors and her own psychological responses. She developed a healthy respect for the complexity of working with intelligent predators while learning to manage her tendency toward obsessive observation. "I still think about Nanook and Siku," Elena said during one of her final therapy sessions, "but now I can appreciate their intelligence without feeling threatened by it. They're remarkable animals, and my experience with them taught me as much about human psychology as it did about polar bear behavior." The incident ultimately strengthened the Detroit Zoo's reputation for animal care and staff safety, demonstrating the facility's commitment to taking all concerns seriously and implementing necessary changes based on evidence rather than assumptions. Elena's ordeal, while personally costly, had prevented a potentially dangerous situation and advanced understanding of captive animal cognition. Dr. Foster's final report on Elena's case became required reading for zoological professionals working with dangerous animals. The case study illustrated the complex relationship between expertise, stress, and psychological health in high-pressure animal care environments. Elena Cruz represents both the best and the risks of professional dedication, Foster wrote. Her expertise saved lives and advanced scientific understanding, but the personal cost demonstrates the need for comprehensive support systems for employees working in psychologically demanding roles. Years later, Eleanor would look back on her experience with mixed emotions. The breakdown had been traumatic and professionally costly, but it had also led to important improvements in zoo safety and animal management. Her legacy was complicated but significant. She had identified a real threat and prevented potential tragedy, even though the process had nearly destroyed her. Sometimes being right isn't enough, Elena reflected. Sometimes you have to be right in the right way at the right time, with the right support systems in place. I was right about the bears, but I was wrong about how to handle that knowledge. The polar bears continued to thrive under their modified management protocols, their intelligence channeled toward appropriate activities, while their magnificent presence continued to educate and inspire visitors. But staff who worked with them never forgot Elena's warnings about the cognitive capabilities of apex predators, and they maintained the enhanced vigilance and respect that her observations had demanded. The enclosure remained a place of wonder and education, but it was also a reminder of the complexity of relationships between humans and intelligent predators. Elena's story became part of the facility's institutional memory, a cautionary tale about the psychological costs of working with animals whose intelligence and power demanded constant respect and attention. In the end, Elena's paranoia had been both right and wrong. Right about the bear's intelligence and capabilities, wrong about their intentions. The distinction between those two aspects of her concerns would continue to shape how professionals approach the care of dangerous animals, balancing healthy respect with pathological fear, expertise with obsession, and dedication with self-preservation. The next stories. Into the wild, dark, into the wild dark. The morning mist clung to the Yellowstone River like a gossamer shroud, its tendrils weaving between the lodgepole pines that stood sentinel along the banks. April 2nd dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that promised adventure to those brave enough to venture into the wilderness during the park's shoulder season. For Brian Michael Duncan, 28, and his new bride Melissa Catherine Duncan, née Williams, 26, it was meant to be the perfect continuation of their honeymoon, a chance to explore the backcountry trails before the summer crowds descended upon America's first national park. Brian stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, his lean frame carved by years of rock climbing and trail running. His dark brown hair caught the early morning light as he meticulously checked their gear for the 3rd time that morning. A software engineer from Denver, he approached everything with the methodical precision that had made him successful in his career. But it was his passion for the outdoors that truly defined him. He'd proposed to Melissa at sunrise on Mount Elbert the previous summer, and she'd said yes before he could finish asking the question. Melissa, a pediatric nurse with honey blonde hair and green eyes that sparkled with perpetual curiosity, was examining their permits and trail maps spread across the picnic table at their campsite in the Canyon Campground. At 5 feet 6 inches, she was athletic from years of marathon training, but it was her methodical nature and medical background that made her the perfect hiking partner for Brian's more impulsive tendencies. She'd grown up in Vermont, the daughter of a park ranger father and a biology teacher mother, so the wilderness was as familiar to her as a hospital ward. "Weather looks perfect for the next 3 days," Brian said, consulting the NOAA forecast on his satellite communicator. "Highs in the mid-50s, lows around 30. No precipitation expected until Thursday." Melissa nodded, folding the topographical map of the Fairy Falls Trail and its surrounding backcountry. "We should reach the first designated camping area by noon if we maintain a steady pace. The trail guide says it's a moderate 7-mile hike with about 800 feet of elevation gain." Their campsite neighbor, a weathered man in his early 60s named Robert Bob Hendricks, emerged from his travel trailer with a steaming cup of coffee. Bob was a retired wildlife biologist who'd spent 37 years working for the National Park Service, with the last 15 devoted specifically to bear management in Yellowstone. His silver beard and deep-set blue eyes spoke of decades spent in the wilderness, and his presence had been both reassuring and slightly unsettling to the newlyweds when he'd struck up a conversation with them the previous evening. "You folks heading out on the Fairy Falls Trail today?" Bob asked, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who'd spent too many nights around campfires. "Beautiful hike, but you should know that the bear activity has been unusually high this spring. Had 3 different grizzly sightings reported in that area just last week." Brian looked up from stuffing his sleeping bag into its compression sack. "We've got bear spray, bells, and we'll be making plenty of noise. Plus, aren't they mostly still coming out of hibernation? Should be sluggish, right?" Bob's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile, but his eyes remained serious. "That's exactly when they're most dangerous, son. A bear coming out of hibernation is hungry, disoriented, and protective of any food sources they find. Plus, this has been an unusually warm winter, which means some of them never went into full hibernation. They've been active all winter long. Melissa felt a small chill run down her spine, but she pushed it aside. She'd hiked in bear country before, including several trips to Glacier National Park with her father. What about the time of year? Isn't this still early season for most wildlife activity? Normally, yes, Bob replied, taking a sip of his coffee. But climate change has been shifting patterns. We're seeing bears emerge earlier and stay active later. And there's something else. We've had reports of a large male grizzly, probably 800 to 900 pounds, that's been ranging through that area for the past month. The rangers have designated him Bear 274, and he's shown some concerning behavior patterns. Brian's methodical packing slowed as he absorbed this information. What kind of concerning behaviors? Bob set down his coffee cup and walked closer to their picnic table, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. He's been following human scent trails, investigating campsites even when they're occupied, and he's shown no fear of noisemakers. Usually bears will retreat when they hear human voices or bear bells. This one seems curious about humans, which is never a good sign. The morning sun climbed higher over the Yellowstone landscape, casting long shadows between the pine trees. Other campers were beginning to stir throughout the canyon campground, the sounds of zippers, clanking cookware, and muffled conversations creating the familiar symphony of outdoor enthusiasts preparing for their daily adventures. Melissa studied the trail map more carefully, noting the various marked camping areas, water sources, and emergency evacuation points. Are there any alternate routes we should consider? We really want to see the Grand Prismatic Spring overlook from the backcountry side. The Fairy Falls Trail is still your best bet for that, Bob admitted. Just be extra cautious. Travel during the middle of the day when visibility is best, make noise constantly, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, don't hesitate to turn around. Brian finished loading his 60-liter backpack, checking the weight distribution and adjusting the shoulder straps. The pack contained their 3-day supply of food, a lightweight 2-person tent, sleeping bags rated for 20 degrees, a portable stove, water purification tablets, first aid kit, emergency shelter, headlamps, extra batteries, and various other survival essentials. The total weight came to 38 pounds, well within his comfort range for multi-day hiking. Melissa's pack was slightly smaller but equally well organized. As a nurse, she'd insisted on carrying an extensive first aid kit that included prescription medications, bandages, antiseptics, and emergency trauma supplies. Her pack also contained their shared communication devices, a satellite communicator with GPS tracking, 2-way radios, and a personal locator beacon that could summon emergency services from anywhere in the world. One more thing, Bob said, reaching into his trailer and emerging with a small electronic device. This is a motion-activated trail camera. I've been documenting wildlife patterns in the park for my research. Would you mind placing it somewhere along your route? Just secure it to a tree about chest high, facing a natural wildlife corridor or water source. Brian accepted the camera, examining its weatherproof housing and simple activation switch. What kind of research are you conducting? I'm working on a long-term study of how climate change is affecting predator behavior patterns in Greater Yellowstone. The data we're collecting is showing some disturbing trends. Bears are ranging further from their traditional territories, staying active during periods when they should be dormant and showing increased aggression toward humans. The implications of Bob's research settled over the couple like a shadow. Melissa folded the trail map and secured it in the top pocket of her pack, accessible but protected from moisture. We'll find a good spot for the camera and activate it on our way out. Bob nodded approvingly. The battery should last about 2 weeks, and the memory card can store several hundred images. Just remember to retrieve it on your way back. Those cameras aren't cheap, and the data could be valuable for understanding what's happening out there. By 9:30 in the morning, Brian and Melissa had completed their final preparations. They'd eaten a substantial breakfast of oatmeal, dried fruit and coffee, filled their water bottles from the campground's potable water source, and double-checked their emergency supplies. Brian had programmed their intended route into the GPS unit and shared their itinerary with the park rangers at the Canyon Visitor Center. Their planned route would take them southwest from the Grand Loop Road, following the Fairy Falls Trail for approximately 4 miles, before branching off onto a lesser-used connector trail that would lead them to a designated backcountry camping area near Sentinel Creek. From there, they planned to day hike to various scenic overlooks before returning to their base camp for 2 nights, then hiking out via a different route that would allow them to see additional wilderness areas. Sarah Martinez, the supervising park ranger at Canyon, had reviewed their backcountry permit and itinerary with professional thoroughness. A 15-year veteran of the National Park Service, Sarah had seen her share of wilderness emergencies and took every precaution seriously. At 34, she maintained the kind of fitness necessary for backcountry rescues, and her knowledge of Yellowstone's terrain was encyclopedic. "Weather looks good for your trip," Sarah had told them while stamping their permits, "but keep in mind that conditions can change rapidly at this elevation and time of year. If you encounter any wildlife, especially bears, remember your training. Make noise, back away slowly, and use your bear spray only if the animal approaches within 25 feet. She'd also provided them with a laminated card detailing the latest wildlife activity reports for their area. "We've had several grizzly sightings in the Fairy Falls area over the past 2 weeks. Most have been distant sightings with no aggressive behavior, but rangers did have to relocate one young male who was getting too comfortable around the tourist areas." Brian had studied the wildlife report carefully, noting the GPS coordinates of each sighting and cross-referencing them with their planned route. The most recent sighting had been 3 days earlier, about 2 miles from their intended camping area, but the bear had been observed feeding on winterkill elk remains and had shown no interest in the reporting ranger's presence. As they shouldered their packs and began walking toward the trailhead, other hikers were also preparing for their adventures. A family of 4 from Minnesota, David and Jennifer Thompson with their teenage sons, Kyle and Marcus, were organizing their day hiking gear for a trip to the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. David, a high school biology teacher, was using the trip as an educational opportunity for his sons, pointing out various geological features and discussing the ecological significance of the region. "Look at those sedimentary layers in the canyon walls," David was explaining to Kyle, a 16-year-old who seemed more interested in his smartphone than the natural wonders surrounding him. "Each layer represents millions of years of geological history. The volcanic activity that created this landscape was incredibly complex." Marcus, 14 and more engaged with his surroundings, asked his father about the wildlife they might encounter. "Dad, what's the difference between black bears and grizzly bears? How would we know which one we're looking at?" Jennifer Thompson, overhearing the conversation, looked up from organizing their day packs. "That's a great question, Marcus. I read that grizzlies are generally larger and have a distinctive shoulder hump, while black bears are smaller and have a straighter facial profile." David nodded approvingly at his wife's contribution. "That's right, but the most important thing to remember is that both species should be treated with the same level of caution and respect. They're wild animals with unpredictable behavior patterns." The Thompson family's conversation reminded Brian and Melissa of their own preparation for bear encounters. They'd taken a wilderness safety course the previous summer that included detailed instruction on bear behavior, proper food storage techniques, and emergency response procedures. The course had been taught by a former park ranger who'd emphasized that knowledge and preparation were the best defenses against wildlife encounters. "The key thing to remember," their instructor had said, "is that most bears want nothing to do with humans. They'll avoid you if they know you're coming, which is why making noise is so important. But if you do encounter a bear, your response should depend on the species and the circumstances. The instructor had gone on to explain the differences between defensive encounters, where a bear felt threatened and was reacting to protect cubs or a food source, and predatory encounters, which were extremely rare but potentially more dangerous. In a defensive encounter with a grizzly, you want to appear non-threatening, avoid eye contact, back away slowly, and speak in a calm voice. If the bear charges, play dead. With black bears, the advice is different. Fight back if attacked, because predatory behavior is more common in black bears. Now, as they approached the Fairy Falls trailhead, Brian and Melissa reviewed these lessons one more time. The morning sun was climbing higher, burning off the last traces of mist from the river valley. The temperature was already approaching 50 degrees, perfect for hiking in layers that could be adjusted as the day progressed. The Fairy Falls Trail began as a wide, well-maintained path that had originally been a road built for construction of the Grand Loop Road in the early 1970s. The first mile and a half followed this former roadway, providing easy walking through mixed forest of lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, and scattered aspen groves. Spring wildflowers were just beginning to emerge in the understory, glacier lilies pushing through patches of remaining snow, and the early green shoots of various grasses and sedges. Brian and Melissa maintained a steady pace, pausing occasionally to consult their map and observe their surroundings. The forest was alive with bird activity, mountain chickadees calling from the pine branches, red-breasted nuthatches spiraling around tree trunks, and the distant drumming of woodpeckers. Occasionally, they glimpsed larger birds, a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, or ravens performing aerial acrobatics in the warming air. "Listen," Melissa said, stopping abruptly about 45 minutes into their hike. "Do you hear that?" Brian paused and tilted his head, filtering out the ambient forest sounds. In the distance, he could make out what sounded like breaking branches and heavy movement through the underbrush. "Could be elk," he suggested, "or maybe a moose." They stood motionless for several minutes, listening carefully. The sounds seemed to be moving away from the trail, deeper into the forest to their north. Whatever was making the noise was large, too large to be deer, and moving with the kind of deliberate, heavy-footed gait that suggested a substantial animal. "Should we make some noise?" Melissa asked, her hand instinctively moving toward the bear spray clipped to her hip belt. Brian considered this question carefully. Their wilderness safety training had emphasized the importance of announcing their presence to avoid surprising wildlife, but it had also cautioned against overreacting to normal forest sounds. "Let's call out once and see if it moves away," he decided. "Hey, bear!" Brian called in a loud, steady voice. "Coming through!" The forest fell silent. The breaking branches and heavy footfalls stopped immediately, as if whatever was making the sounds had frozen in place. Brian and Melissa waited, their hearts beating a little faster, but after several minutes of complete quiet, they resumed hiking. The former road portion of the trail ended at a cable fence designed to prevent vehicle access, and the trail narrowed to a typical hiking path winding through denser forest. Here, the canopy closed overhead, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere with filtered sunlight streaming through the pine boughs. The undergrowth was thicker, with patches of huckleberry bushes, mountain ash, and various wildflowers creating a rich tapestry of colors and textures. At the 2-mile mark, they reached their first significant landmark, a small wooden bridge crossing Fairy Creek. The creek was running high with snowmelt, its clear water gurgling over smooth granite stones. They paused on the bridge to refill their water bottles and add purification tablets, enjoying the peaceful sound of flowing water and the fresh, cool air rising from the creek bed. "This would be a perfect spot for Bob's trail camera," Melissa observed, scanning the area for suitable mounting locations. "There's obviously a lot of wildlife activity around this water source." Brian studied the surrounding terrain, noting several game trails converging near the creek. Animal tracks were visible in the soft soil along the water's edge. Elk, deer, and what appeared to be smaller predators like coyotes or possibly wolves. "Let's scout around for the best placement," he agreed. They spent 10 minutes exploring the area around the bridge, looking for a tree with the right characteristics for mounting the motion-activated camera. Brian eventually selected a large Douglas fir about 30 feet upstream from the bridge, with a clear view of both the creek crossing and a well-used game trail that disappeared into the forest. The camera installation took another 15 minutes. Brian had to use a small folding saw from their gear to clear a few small branches that might trigger false activations, while Melissa consulted the instruction manual to ensure they had the optimal angle and height. The finished installation was nearly invisible from the trail, but positioned to capture any large mammals that approached the water source. "Bob's going to get some interesting footage from this location," Melissa predicted, activating the camera and watching for the indicator light that confirmed it was functioning properly. By 11:30, they were making good progress toward their planned camping area. The trail continued to wind through mixed forest, gradually gaining elevation as it followed the contours of the surrounding ridges. Occasionally they caught glimpses through the trees of the broader Yellowstone landscape, distant mountain ranges, steam rising from thermal features, and the vast expanse of wilderness that stretched in all directions. The forest around them was showing more signs of wildlife activity as they moved deeper into the backcountry. They observed several areas where large animals had rubbed against trees, leaving behind tufts of dark fur and scent markings. Brian photographed these signs for later identification, though he suspected they were from elk or possibly bison rather than predators. At a small clearing where the trail crossed a seasonal stream, they encountered their first other hikers of the day, a group of 3 college students from Montana State University who were conducting research for a senior thesis project on ecosystem recovery following the 1988 fires. The students, Emma Rodriguez, a wildlife biology major, Jake Patterson, studying environmental science, and Ashley Chen, majoring in forestry, had been in the backcountry for 4 days and were hiking out that morning. Emma, who appeared to be the group leader, was excited to share their observations with fellow outdoor enthusiasts. "We've been studying how different plant communities are re-establishing themselves in areas that burned 37 years ago," she explained, gesturing toward the surrounding forest. "The succession patterns are really fascinating. Some areas have returned to their pre-fire state, while others have developed entirely different ecological communities." Jake, tall and lanky with the kind of deep tan that comes from spending most of your time outdoors, added his own observations about wildlife activity. "We've seen tons of elk, several deer species, and some really interesting bird populations. But we also had a pretty close encounter with a bear yesterday evening." Brian and Melissa's attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of bear?" Melissa asked. "Where was this?" Ashley consulted her field notebook, flipping through pages covered with detailed observations and sketches. It was definitely a grizzly, huge shoulder hump, very distinctive facial profile. We estimated it at maybe 700 or 800 pounds. The encounter was about 3 miles up this trail, near the junction with the Sentinel Creek connector. "That's right in the area where we're planning to camp," Brian said, his voice carrying a note of concern. "What was the bear's behavior like?" Emma and Jake exchanged glances. "That's what was really strange about it," Emma admitted. "We were setting up camp for the night, and Jake spotted it watching us from maybe 100 yards away. We followed all the protocols, made noise, slowly backed away from our gear, got our bear spray ready." Jake picked up the narrative. "But the bear didn't leave. It just sat there watching us. We were making all kinds of noise, but it seemed completely uninterested in moving on. Eventually it got up and started walking toward our campsite." "What did you do?" Melissa asked, her medical training making her think immediately about emergency response procedures. We grabbed our essential gear and relocated about half a mile down the trail, Ashley replied. We watched from a distance with binoculars, and the bear spent about 20 minutes investigating our original campsite. It didn't damage anything, but it was clearly very interested in human scent. Emma nodded grimly. The really concerning thing was that it seemed to follow our scent trail when we moved to our new location. We could see it in the distance, just watching us. It never approached closer than about 200 yards, but it stayed in the area all night. This information was deeply troubling to Brian and Melissa. Everything they'd learned about bear behavior suggested that healthy wild bears should retreat from human presence, not investigate it. The behavior described by the college students sounded exactly like what Bob Hendricks had warned them about regarding Bear 274. "Did you report this encounter to the Rangers?" Brian asked. "We tried," Jake replied, "but our satellite communicator has been having problems for the past 2 days. We're planning to report it as soon as we reach the ranger station." The two groups spent another 10 minutes comparing notes about trail conditions, weather observations, and wildlife sightings. The college students had compiled an impressive amount of data during their 4-day backcountry trip, including detailed photographs of various animal signs, plant communities, and geological features. "One more thing you should know," Ashley said, as they prepared to continue their respective journeys. "We found some really fresh bear scat this morning, maybe half a mile back down the trail from here. It was still steaming when we found it, so whatever left it was very close by." Emma added her own professional assessment. Based on the size and contents of the scat, it was definitely from a large grizzly, probably the same one that investigated our campsite last night. The contents were mostly vegetation, roots, early grass shoots, and some winter kill remains, which is normal for this time of year, but the size of it suggests a really substantial animal. As the college students continued their hike out toward the trailhead, Brian and Melissa took a short break to reassess their plans. They spread their map on a fallen log and reviewed their intended route, considering whether they should modify their itinerary based on this new information about recent bear activity. The encounter they described was right in the area where we're planning to set up base camp, Melissa observed, tracing their planned route with her finger. "Maybe we should consider camping somewhere else." Brian studied the topographical map carefully, looking for alternative camping areas that would still allow them to complete their planned day hikes. "There are a couple of other designated camping spots we could use, but they would add several miles to our overall trip, and we'd miss some of the scenic areas we wanted to visit." The decision wasn't easy. They'd been planning this backcountry adventure for months, had obtained the necessary permits for their specific itinerary, and both were confident in their wilderness skills and bear safety knowledge. On the other hand, the recent wildlife activity in their planned camping area was clearly more significant than normal. "What's your gut feeling?" Melissa asked, falling back on the decision-making approach they'd developed during their 5-year relationship. When facing difficult choices, they'd learned to trust their combined intuition alongside their analytical evaluation of the facts. Brian considered this question for several minutes, weighing their options. "I think we proceed with caution, but stick to our original plan. We've got all the right gear, we know what to do if we encounter wildlife, and we're both experienced hikers." The students said the bear didn't show any aggressive behavior, it was just curious. Melissa nodded slowly, and they were able to manage the situation by relocating their campsite. "If we encounter any problems, we can always hike out early." They resumed their hike with heightened awareness of their surroundings. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified. The crack of dead branches, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the distant calls of birds. Their conversation, which had been relaxed and wide-ranging during the first part of their hike, became more focused on immediate observations about the trail, weather conditions, and potential hazards. The terrain began to change as they approached the junction with the Sentinel Creek Connector Trail. The forest thinned somewhat, with larger openings allowing views of the surrounding ridges and valleys. Avalanche chutes scarred some of the steeper slopes, creating natural meadows where different plant communities had established themselves. These openings were prime habitat for many wildlife species, including bears searching for early-season vegetation. At 12:15, they reached the trail junction marked by a weathered wooden sign indicating distances and directions to various backcountry destinations. The Sentinel Creek Connector was less maintained than the main Fairy Falls Trail, requiring more careful navigation and route-finding skills. According to their map, their designated camping area was approximately 2 miles along this connector trail. Before leaving the main trail, they took another extended break to eat lunch and observe their surroundings. Brian pulled out his binoculars and scanned the various clearings and meadows visible from their position, looking for any signs of wildlife activity. Melissa consulted their water sources map and checked their remaining supplies. "I can see at least 3 different game trails converging in that meadow," Brian reported, lowering his binoculars and pointing toward a grassy opening about half a mile to their northwest. "Definitely looks like an active wildlife corridor." Melissa was studying the medical supplies in their first aid kit, making sure everything was easily accessible and in good condition. As a pediatric nurse, she'd treated numerous outdoor injury cases and knew how quickly situations could deteriorate in remote locations. Their kit included supplies for treating everything from minor cuts and blisters to serious trauma injuries, plus prescription medications for pain, infection, and allergic reactions. "Weather's holding perfect," she observed, checking the sky for any signs of developing clouds. "Temperature must be close to 60 degrees now." The connector trail lived up to its reputation as a more challenging route. Within the first quarter mile, they encountered several stream crossings requiring careful rock hopping to keep their boots dry, and a steep climb up a rocky outcrop where the trail had been washed out by spring runoff. Brian's rock climbing experience proved valuable in negotiating these obstacles, while Melissa's balance and coordination from years of marathon training allowed her to navigate the technical sections with confidence. The forest composition changed as they gained elevation, with lodgepole pines giving way to more diverse stands of Douglas fir, Engelmann spruce, and scattered whitebark pine. The understory included more alpine species, beargrass, mountain heather, and various wildflowers that thrived in the cooler, moister conditions of higher elevation. About a mile along the connector trail, they encountered the fresh bear scat that the college students had mentioned. It was unmistakably large, approximately 6 inches in diameter and 18 inches long, and contained exactly the materials Emma had described: partially digested vegetation, small bones from winter kill scavenging, and various plant fibers. The scat was still dark and moist, indicating it had been deposited within the past few hours. "That's from a very large animal," Melissa observed, studying the scat from a respectful distance. "Probably the same bear the students encountered last night." Brian photographed the scat with his camera, noting the GPS coordinates and timestamp for potential reporting to park rangers. "The fact that it's so fresh suggests the bear is still in this immediate area. We should be extra vigilant as we continue toward the camping area." They resumed hiking with even greater attention to their surroundings, stopping frequently to listen for sounds of large animals and scanning the forest ahead for any signs of movement. Their bear bells, which had been jingling steadily throughout the morning, now seemed inadequate for announcing their presence in what was clearly active bear habitat. The designated camping area, when they finally reached it at 2:30 in the afternoon, was everything they'd hoped for based on the descriptions in their backcountry guide. Situated on a small rise overlooking Sentinel Creek, the site offered spectacular views of the surrounding wilderness while providing good drainage and access to water. A fire ring and food storage pole had been installed by the Park Service, and several previous camping groups had left the area in pristine condition. "This is absolutely perfect," Melissa said, dropping her pack and stretching her back muscles. "I can see why this site is so popular with backcountry hikers." Brian was already surveying the area for the optimal tent placement, considering factors like wind protection, morning sun exposure, and drainage in case of unexpected precipitation. "Let's set up camp and then do some exploring before dinner. I'd like to scout our planned day hike routes and get familiar with the local terrain." Setting up their lightweight two-person tent took only 15 minutes, thanks to years of practice and a well-designed system of color-coded poles and clips. Brian had purchased the tent specifically for backcountry use. It weighed only 3 pounds, but was rated for severe weather conditions, including high winds and heavy snow loads. Melissa organized their food supplies according to bear safety protocols, separating anything with scent into bear-proof containers that would be stored on the designated food pole. Their menu for the 3-day trip consisted of freeze-dried meals supplemented with energy bars, nuts, dried fruit, and instant coffee. Every item had been selected based on weight, nutritional value, and packaging that wouldn't create odors attractive to wildlife. The afternoon exploration of their surrounding area revealed why this location was such prime wildlife habitat. Sentinel Creek provided a year-round water source that supported lush, riparian vegetation, while the surrounding slopes offered diverse plant communities ranging from dense forest to open meadows. Game trails crisscrossed the area, and they observed numerous signs of recent animal activity. "Look at this tree," Brian called out, examining a large Douglas fir about 50 yards from their campsite. "These claw marks go up at least 8 feet. Melissa joined him in examining the tree, which showed extensive scratching and rubbing marks on its bark. The claw marks were deeply gouged into the wood, indicating an animal with substantial size and strength. Tufts of dark brown fur were caught in the rough bark at various heights. "Those marks are fresh," she observed, noting that the exposed wood hadn't yet weathered or darkened. "And look at the height. Whatever made them is much larger than a black bear." Brian measured the highest claw marks using his hiking pole as a reference. "These go up almost 10 feet. That suggests a grizzly standing on its hind legs, and a very large one at that." The discovery of such extensive bear signs so close to their campsite was concerning, but not necessarily dangerous. Bears often mark trees to communicate with other bears in the area, and the behavior was normal territorial activity. However, the freshness of the marks indicated that a large grizzly had been in this exact location very recently. They spent the rest of the afternoon familiarizing themselves with the area, identifying potential hazards and escape routes, and enjoying the spectacular wilderness scenery that had drawn them to this location. The views from various vantage points around their campsite included distant mountain ranges, thermal features sending steam into the clear air, and the vast expanse of the Yellowstone ecosystem stretching to the horizon. As evening approached, they prepared dinner using their lightweight camp stove, taking care to cook and eat well away from their sleeping area in accordance with bear safety guidelines. The freeze-dried beef stroganoff tasted surprisingly good after a day of hiking, and they supplemented it with hot tea and energy bars while watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. "Listen to how quiet it is," Melissa said as they finished cleaning their cooking gear and storing everything in bear-proof containers. "You can actually hear the silence." Brian nodded, appreciating the profound quiet that only comes from being deep in wilderness areas, far from human activity. Occasionally, they could hear the gentle murmur of Sentinel Creek, the distant call of a loon from some hidden lake, or the soft rustle of wind in the pine boughs. But otherwise, the world around them was wrapped in peaceful silence. As darkness fell, they retreated to their tent and used headlamps to review their plans for the following day. According to their itinerary, they would day hike to several scenic overlooks, including a backcountry viewpoint of Grand Prismatic Spring that was accessible only to backpacking groups willing to make the challenging trek through unmarked terrain. "Tomorrow's route should take us about 6 miles total," Brian said, tracing their planned path on the topographical map. "We'll gain about 1,200 feet of elevation, but most of it's gradual except for one steep section near the thermal overlook." Melissa was reviewing her digital camera settings, preparing for what she hoped would be spectacular photography opportunities. The weather forecast still looks perfect. Clear skies, light winds, temperature around 65 degrees. Conditions should be ideal for outdoor photography. They settled into their sleeping bags around 9 o'clock, listening to the night sounds of the forest gradually coming alive around them. Owls called from the darkness, and occasionally they heard the distant howl of wolves or coyotes echoing across the wilderness. These sounds, while sometimes startling to urban dwellers, were comforting reminders that they were experiencing nature as it was meant to be, wild, uncontrolled, and magnificent. Brian was just drifting off to sleep when he heard something that made him instantly alert, the sound of heavy footsteps circling their campsite. The footfalls were deliberate and measured, too large to be from deer or elk, and moving with the kind of purposeful gait that suggested intelligence and curiosity rather than random wandering. "Melissa," he whispered, reaching over to gently shake her shoulder. "Wake up. Something's outside." Melissa came instantly awake, her medical training having taught her to transition quickly from sleep to full alertness when emergencies arose. She lay motionless, listening carefully to the sounds outside their tent. The footsteps had stopped, but she could hear heavy breathing and what sounded like sniffing or snorting. They remained perfectly still for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. The sounds outside their tent continued intermittently, footsteps, heavy breathing, and occasionally what sounded like a large animal investigating their stored gear on the food pole. Whatever was outside was clearly aware of their presence, but wasn't showing signs of aggression or fear. Eventually, the sounds moved away from their immediate campsite, though they could still hear heavy movement in the forest for some time afterward. Neither Brian nor Melissa slept well that night, remaining alert for any indication that their visitor had returned. Dawn came early to their high-elevation campsite, with the first rays of sunlight filtering through the pine boughs around 6:30. Brian emerged from the tent to check their gear and found everything exactly as they'd left it the night before. Their food storage system had worked perfectly, and whatever had visited their campsite hadn't attempted to access any of their supplies. The morning air was crisp and clear, perfect for their planned day hike to the scenic overlooks. After a breakfast of instant oatmeal, dried fruit and coffee, they loaded their day packs with water, snacks, camera equipment, and emergency supplies. The plan was to complete their 6-mile loop hike and return to base camp by late afternoon, leaving plenty of time to relax and enjoy their wilderness setting. "No signs of damage or disturbance," Brian reported after completing a thorough inspection of their campsite. "Whatever visited us last night was curious, but not destructive." Melissa was examining the ground around their tent for tracks or other sign. "I can see some partial prints in this soft soil, but nothing clear enough to make a positive identification. Definitely a large animal, though, probably the same bear that left those claw marks on the tree." The day hike began with a steep climb through dense forest, following an unmarked route that required careful navigation using their topographical map and GPS unit. The terrain was challenging, but not technically difficult, and both Brian and Melissa were in excellent physical condition from years of regular hiking and running. As they gained elevation, the forest began to thin, and the views became increasingly spectacular. They could see the grand prismatic spring complex in the distance, with its characteristic rainbow-colored mineral deposits and clouds of steam rising into the morning air. Other thermal features dotted the landscape as far as they could see, creating an otherworldly panorama that seemed almost alien in its beauty. "I can't believe we have this entire wilderness to ourselves," Melissa said during one of their rest stops, surveying the vast landscape that stretched in all directions without any sign of human presence. Brian was using his binoculars to scan their planned route ahead, checking for potential obstacles or hazards. "Look at that meadow system down in the valley. It's like a natural highway for wildlife movement. I bet we see some interesting animals today." Their prediction proved accurate. During the course of their 6-mile loop hike, they observed elk, deer, several species of birds they couldn't identify without their field guide, and what appeared to be wolf tracks in a muddy section of trail. The wildlife viewing opportunities were extraordinary, providing the kind of authentic wilderness experience that had drawn them to backcountry camping in the first place. The highlight of their day came at the overlook of Grand Prismatic Spring, where they spent nearly an hour photographing and simply absorbing the incredible natural spectacle spread out below them. The spring's rainbow mineral deposits were even more vivid from their elevated backcountry perspective, and the steam rising from the superheated water created constantly changing patterns of light and shadow. "These are going to be some of the best photographs we've ever taken," Melissa said, adjusting her camera settings to capture the dramatic lighting conditions. "The backcountry perspective is so different from what you see from the boardwalks." Brian was sketching the thermal features in his journal, trying to capture details that wouldn't show up in photographs. "I'm starting to understand why Bob Hendricks has devoted his career to studying this ecosystem. The complexity and beauty of it is just overwhelming." They reached their maximum elevation around noon, at a rocky outcrop that provided panoramic views in all directions. The lunch break at this location included energy bars, trail mix, and plenty of water, while they absorbed the magnificent scenery and planned the remainder of their route back to base camp. The return trip followed a different path that took them through varied terrain, including several stream crossings and a section of trail that wound through an area recovering from a forest fire several decades earlier. The regenerating forest provided interesting contrasts in plant communities and wildlife habitat, and they observed several species of birds that seemed to prefer the more open conditions created by the fire. By mid-afternoon, they were approaching their base camp along Sentinel Creek, tired but exhilarated from their successful day hike. The weather had remained perfect throughout the day, and they'd encountered no significant hazards or problems. As they crested the small rise that led down to their camping area, Brian stopped abruptly and grabbed Melissa's arm. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice tight with tension. In their campsite, approximately 50 yards away, was the largest bear either of them had ever seen. The animal was massive, easily 8 feet tall when standing on its hind legs, as it was doing while investigating their tent. Its dark brown fur gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and the distinctive shoulder hump immediately identified it as a grizzly of exceptional size. The bear was methodically examining their campsite, moving from the tent to their gear storage area to the fire ring, sniffing everything with obvious intelligence and curiosity. It showed no signs of aggression or fear, but its behavior was clearly abnormal for a wild bear that should have avoided any area with human scent. Brian and Melissa remained frozen in position, watching the enormous animal explore their temporary home. They were uphill from the bear and downwind, which meant it hadn't detected their presence yet. Their bear spray was easily accessible, but they were much further than the recommended 25-foot range for effective deployment. "What do we do?" Melissa whispered, her medical training providing no guidance for this unprecedented situation. Brian was running through everything he'd learned about bear behavior, trying to determine the best course of action. The animal wasn't showing signs of aggression, but its size and behavior patterns were unlike anything described in their wilderness safety training. This was clearly the same bear that had visited their campsite the night before and had been reported by the college students, Bear 274, the animal that Bob Hendricks had warned them about. "We wait," Brian whispered back. "As long as it's not showing aggressive behavior, we don't want to startle it or trigger a defensive response." The bear continued its investigation for another 10 minutes, occasionally dropping to all fours to examine something more closely, then rearing up again to get a better view of the surrounding area. Its movements were deliberate and intelligent, more like a scientist conducting research than a wild animal foraging for food. Eventually, the bear seemed to lose interest in their campsite and began moving away toward the creek. It moved with surprising grace for such a large animal, disappearing into the forest with barely a sound despite its massive size. Brian and Melissa remained in position for another 15 minutes, making sure the bear had truly departed before approaching their camp. "That was Bear 274, Brian said with certainty as they finally made their way down to their campsite. "Had to be. The size matches everything Bob described, and the behavior is exactly what the college students reported." Their tent and gear appeared undamaged, though it was clear the bear had investigated everything thoroughly. The scent of the animal was still strong in the area, a musky, wild smell that seemed to permeate their entire campsite. All their food storage protocols had worked perfectly. The bear hadn't been able to access any of their supplies. "We need to report this encounter," Melissa said, pulling out their satellite communicator. "This level of curiosity about humans isn't normal bear behavior, and other hikers need to know about it." The satellite communicator took several minutes to acquire a signal and connect with emergency services, but eventually Brian was able to speak with a ranger at the Canyon Visitor Center. He provided a detailed report of their bear encounter, including the animal's size, behavior, and exact location, as well as the information they'd received from the college students about previous sightings. "We're going to recommend that you consider hiking out early," the ranger told him over the crackling satellite connection. "We've had several reports of this particular bear over the past week, and its behavior is concerning enough that we're considering closing this area to backcountry camping." Brian looked at Melissa, who had been listening to his side of the conversation. They'd been planning to spend 2 more nights at this location, but the repeated visits from the same large bear were clearly escalating beyond normal wildlife encounters. "What's your recommendation for our immediate safety?" Brian asked the ranger. "If you decide to stay tonight, make absolutely sure all scented items are properly stored, and consider sleeping with your bear spray immediately accessible. The bear hasn't shown aggression, but its persistent interest in human presence is unprecedented in our experience." After ending the satellite call, Brian and Melissa spent considerable time discussing their options. They could hike out that evening, reaching the trailhead by dark if they maintained a fast pace, or they could stay for their planned itinerary while taking extra precautions. The decision was complicated by their genuine love of the wilderness experience and their confidence in their outdoor skills. "I hate to cut the trip short," Melissa admitted. "This is exactly the kind of authentic wilderness experience we came here for, even if it includes some uncertainty about wildlife encounters." Brian nodded, understanding her perspective. "But we also can't ignore the fact that this bear's behavior is abnormal enough to concern experienced park rangers. Bob Hendricks has been studying bear behavior for decades, and he was clearly worried about this particular animal. They ultimately decided to stay for 1 more night, while taking every possible precaution for their safety. This included moving their tent to a location with better visibility of the surrounding area, double-checking all their food storage protocols, and keeping their bear spray immediately accessible throughout the night. Dinner preparation took place well away from their sleeping area, and they were meticulous about cleaning all cooking equipment and storing anything with even the slightest scent. Their evening meal was more subdued than the previous night, with both of them remaining constantly alert for any signs of their large visitor's return. As darkness fell, they retreated to their tent earlier than planned and lay in their sleeping bags, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the undergrowth seemed amplified, and neither of them was able to fully relax despite their exhaustion from the day's hiking. Around 11 o'clock, they heard the now familiar sound of heavy footsteps approaching their campsite. This time, however, the bear seemed bolder and more persistent in its investigation. The footsteps circled their tent multiple times, and they could hear heavy breathing and sniffing from just outside the thin nylon walls that separated them from the massive predator. "It's right outside," Melissa whispered, her voice barely audible even to Brian, lying just inches away. The investigation continued for what seemed like hours, with the bear occasionally placing what sounded like paws against their tent wall, causing the fabric to flex inward without tearing. At one point, they heard the distinctive sound of the bear standing on its hind legs, probably trying to get a better scent of the tent's occupants. Throughout this terrifying ordeal, neither Brian nor Melissa moved or made any sound that might trigger aggressive behavior from the bear. They lay motionless in their sleeping bags, hearts pounding, while the enormous predator conducted its thorough examination of their shelter. Finally, around 2 in the morning, the sounds moved away from their immediate vicinity. They could still hear the bear moving through their campsite and the surrounding forest, but it was no longer directly investigating their tent. Neither of them slept for the remainder of the night. Dawn on April 4th brought clear skies and the decision to pack up and hike out immediately. The extended encounter with Bear 274 had escalated beyond their comfort level, and they were now genuinely concerned about the animal's increasingly bold behavior around humans. "I don't think that bear is afraid of people at all," Brian said, as they quickly broke camp and loaded their backpacks. "That level of investigation and persistence isn't normal for any wild animal." Melissa was conducting a final check of their campsite, making sure they left no trace of their presence that might continue to attract the bear's attention. The ranger was right. This area should probably be closed to backcountry camping until they can figure out what to do about that animal. The hike out began in the pre-dawn darkness, with headlamps lighting their way along the connector trail toward the main Fairy Falls trail. They maintained a fast pace, driven by their eagerness to reach more heavily traveled areas where they would be less likely to encounter the problematic bear. The forest seemed different in the early morning light, more ominous and threatening than it had appeared during their leisurely hike 2 days earlier. Every shadow could conceal a watching predator, and every sound in the undergrowth caused them to pause and scan their surroundings carefully. They reached the junction with the main Fairy Falls trail just as the sun was rising over the eastern ridges, painting the forest in golden light that should have been beautiful, but instead seemed to emphasize how alone they were in this vast wilderness. The main trail felt safer, simply because it was more frequently used by day hikers, but they were still several miles from the trailhead in safety. At the small bridge crossing Fairy Creek, they paused to retrieve Bob Hendricks's trail camera and check its footage. The camera had been active for 3 days and had captured numerous images of wildlife visiting the creek for water. Most of the photos showed elk, deer, and smaller animals, but several images near the end of the sequence made their blood run cold. The final dozen photos, all taken during the previous night, showed Bear 274 investigating the area around the trail camera. The bear was even larger than they'd estimated. The photos provided scale reference points that suggested an animal weighing close to 900 pounds. But most disturbing was the bear's behavior in the images. Rather than simply drinking from the creek or foraging for food, the bear appeared to be following scent trails left by previous hikers. Several photos showed the animal with its nose to the ground, clearly tracking human passage along the trail. This behavior was unprecedented in their experience and suggested a level of interest in humans that went far beyond normal bear curiosity. "We need to get this footage to the park rangers immediately," Melissa said, checking the camera's digital display to ensure all the images had been properly recorded. This proves that the bear is actively tracking hikers, not just randomly encountering them. The remainder of their hike out was completed in record time, driven by their increasing urgency to report their experiences and get the trail camera footage to wildlife management authorities. They reached the Fairy Falls trailhead at 9:30 in the morning, exactly 48 hours after they'd first set out on what was supposed to be a relaxing 3-day backcountry adventure. Bob Hendricks was waiting for them in the parking area, having heard about their early return through the park's communication network. His weathered face showed concern as he listened to their detailed account of the repeated encounters with Bear 274, and his expression became increasingly grim as he reviewed the trail camera footage. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he said, after scrolling through the final images on the camera's display. "This bear has crossed a behavioral threshold that's extremely dangerous for both humans and the bear itself." Sarah Martinez, the supervising park ranger, arrived within minutes of their return and conducted an official interview about their experiences. Her questions were detailed and professional, covering every aspect of their encounters with the bear and the specific behaviors they'd observed. "Based on your report and this photographic evidence, we're implementing an emergency closure of the Fairy Falls backcountry area," Sarah announced after completing her interview. "No additional backcountry permits will be issued for that area until we can address this situation. The closure would affect dozens of planned backcountry trips over the coming weeks, but the safety concerns were too significant to ignore. Bear 274's behavior represented a clear and escalating threat to human visitors, and traditional wildlife management approaches weren't likely to be effective with an animal that showed such persistent interest in human activity." Over the following days, a team of wildlife biologists, park rangers and bear management specialists developed a comprehensive response plan for dealing with Bear 274. The bear's size, intelligence and behavioral patterns made it a unique challenge that required careful consideration of both public safety and wildlife conservation principles. Dr. Amanda Foster, a wildlife biologist with 20 years of experience in bear behavior research, was brought in from Montana State University to assess the situation and develop recommendations. After reviewing all the available evidence, including Brian and Melissa's detailed reports and the trail camera footage, her conclusions were sobering. This bear has developed what we call food conditioning, combined with habituation to humans, Dr. Foster explained during a briefing for park management. The animal has learned to associate human presence with potential food sources, but more importantly, it's lost its natural fear of humans. The combination of factors that had led to Bear 274's problematic behavior was complex and unprecedented in Yellowstone's wildlife management experience. Climate change had disrupted traditional food sources, forcing the bear to expand its foraging range and experiment with new food-seeking strategies. Increased backcountry camping in its territory had provided repeated exposure to human scents and activities, gradually reducing the bear's natural avoidance behaviors. The bear isn't aggressive in the traditional sense, Dr. Foster continued. It's curious, and intelligent, which in many ways makes it more dangerous than an overtly aggressive animal. A curious 900-pound predator with no fear of humans represents an extreme safety risk. The management options for dealing with Bear 274 were limited and controversial. Relocating such a large bear to a different area was technically difficult and unlikely to be successful, as the animal would probably return to its established territory. Aversive conditioning techniques designed to restore the bear's fear of humans were questionable, with an animal that had already demonstrated such persistent interest in human activity. The unfortunate reality, Dr. Foster concluded, is that bears displaying this level of habituation and food conditioning are extremely difficult to manage without removing them from the population. It's a conservation tragedy, but public safety has to be the primary consideration. News of the bear situation began attracting media attention as word spread through hiking and outdoor recreation communities. The story of newlyweds forced to flee their honeymoon campsite by a massive grizzly bear captured public imagination and sparked debates about wilderness management, climate change impacts on wildlife, and the appropriate balance between conservation and public access. Brian and Melissa found themselves at the center of this media attention, though they tried to keep their focus on the scientific and safety aspects of their experience rather than sensationalizing the encounter. They provided interviews to several outdoor recreation magazines and participated in educational programs designed to help other backcountry users understand appropriate responses to wildlife encounters. The important thing people need to understand, Brian explained during one interview, is that we followed all the recommended safety protocols and still encountered a situation that was beyond normal bear behavior patterns. This wasn't a case of inexperienced hikers making mistakes. It was an unusual animal displaying unprecedented behavior. Melissa emphasized the medical and emergency preparedness aspects of their experience. Having proper communication equipment, emergency supplies, and a clear understanding of evacuation procedures was crucial to our safety. If we'd been less prepared or less experienced, this situation could have had a very different outcome. The trail closure remained in effect for 3 weeks, while wildlife management teams attempted various approaches to address the Bear 274 situation. Motion-activated cameras were deployed throughout the area to monitor the bear's movements and behavior, while research teams collected additional data about its foraging patterns and territorial range. Several attempts were made to implement aversive conditioning techniques, using rubber bullets, noisemakers, and other non-lethal deterrents to try to restore the bear's fear of humans. However, these efforts proved unsuccessful, with the bear showing little response to deterrent techniques that were normally effective with other problematic bears. Bear 274 has reached a level of habituation that makes traditional management techniques ineffective, reported Jake Morrison, the park's senior wildlife biologist, after the failed aversive conditioning attempts. This bear's intelligence and size make it uniquely challenging to manage. The situation reached a critical point when Bear 274 was observed entering a developed campground area during daylight hours, investigating occupied campsites while visitors were present. This behavior represented a serious escalation that could no longer be managed through area closures and visitor education. On April 25th, after extensive consultation with wildlife management experts and park administrators, the decision was made to remove Bear 274 from the population. The decision was controversial, but considered necessary for public safety, given the bear's documented behavior patterns and the failure of alternative management approaches. The removal operation was conducted by experienced park rangers using specialized equipment and protocols designed for large predator management. Bear 274 was located using tracking data from motion-activated cameras and removed humanely by a team of wildlife professionals with extensive experience in such operations. This was not a decision we made lightly, Park Superintendent Janet Williams explained during a press conference following the operation. Bear 274 was a magnificent animal and an important part of the Yellowstone ecosystem. However, its behavior had reached a point where public safety concerns outweighed other considerations. The aftermath of the Bear 274 situation led to significant changes in Yellowstone's backcountry management policies and wildlife monitoring procedures. Additional trail cameras were deployed throughout bear habitat areas, and new protocols were established for responding to reports of unusual bear behavior. Bob Hendricks's research on climate change impacts on predator behavior received additional funding and attention following the Bear 274 case. His long-term data collection had provided crucial insights into the factors that contributed to the bear's problematic behavior, and his work became a model for similar research in other wilderness areas. The Bear 274 case represents a new category of wildlife management challenge that we're likely to encounter more frequently as climate change continues to disrupt traditional ecosystem patterns, Bob explained in his final research report. We need to develop new strategies for managing human-wildlife interactions in a changing environment. Brian and Melissa's experience became a case study used in wilderness safety training programs and wildlife management courses. Their detailed documentation of the bear's behavior, combined with the trail camera footage they'd helped collect, provided valuable data for understanding unusual bear behavior patterns. Looking back on the experience, Melissa reflected several months later, we were fortunate to encounter Bear 274 under circumstances that allowed us to document its behavior and get out safely. Other hikers in the same situation might not have been as prepared or as lucky. The couple continued their outdoor adventures, but with an even greater appreciation for the unpredictability of wildlife encounters and the importance of proper preparation for backcountry travel. Their experience with Bear 274 had reinforced their respect for wilderness areas while highlighting the complex challenges facing wildlife managers in an era of environmental change. Wilderness areas like Yellowstone are precious resources that need to be protected and preserved, Brian noted. But the Bear 274 situation showed us that these ecosystems are changing in ways that create new challenges for both wildlife and the humans who visit these areas. The Fairy Falls backcountry area was reopened to camping 6 weeks after the Bear 274 removal, with enhanced safety protocols and increased monitoring for unusual wildlife activity. Park rangers conducted additional patrols in the area, and new requirements were implemented for backcountry permit holders to report any wildlife encounters through improved communication systems. Dr. Foster's research team published several scientific papers based on the Bear 274 case, contributing to the growing body of knowledge about how climate change was affecting large predator behavior patterns throughout North America. The case became a reference point for wildlife managers facing similar challenges in other wilderness areas. The Bear 274 situation was unprecedented in our experience, but it probably won't be the last case of its kind, Dr. Foster predicted in her final research report. Climate change is creating new pressures on wildlife populations that are leading to behavioral adaptations we've never seen before. The trail camera footage that Bob Hendricks had deployed, including the images captured during Brian and Melissa's camping trip, became part of a long-term research database documenting wildlife behavior patterns in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The footage provided valuable insights into how large predators were adapting to changing environmental conditions and increased human presence in their territories. The camera-trapped data from that period showed us behavioral patterns that we'd never observed before in grizzly bears. Bob explained during a scientific conference presentation about his research. Bear 274 was displaying hunting and tracking behaviors typically associated with pack predators like wolves, but adapted for investigating human activity patterns. Sarah Martinez implemented new training protocols for park rangers based on lessons learned from the Bear 274 situation. The training emphasized early recognition of unusual wildlife behavior patterns and improved communication procedures for coordinating responses to developing situations. The Bear 274 case taught us that traditional approaches to wildlife management may not be adequate for dealing with the kinds of behavioral adaptations we're seeing as a result of environmental change, Sarah explained during a ranger training session. We need to be prepared for encounters that fall outside our previous experience. The media coverage of Brian and Melissa's experience sparked broader public discussions about wilderness safety, climate change impacts on wildlife, and the appropriate level of human activity in sensitive ecosystem areas. Environmental organizations used the case to highlight the need for comprehensive climate adaptation strategies that included wildlife management considerations. Public reaction to the Bear 274 removal was mixed, with some outdoor recreation advocates arguing that wilderness areas should remain wild regardless of safety risks, while others supported the Park Service's decision to prioritize visitor safety. The debate reflected broader tensions between conservation goals and public access that are common in wilderness management. The Bear 274 situation illustrates the difficult decisions that park managers face when trying to balance wilderness preservation with public safety, noted Dr. Richard Hayes, a professor of environmental policy at Colorado State University. There are no easy answers when dealing with the intersection of climate change, wildlife behavior, and human recreation. 6 months after their interrupted honeymoon, Brian and Melissa returned to Yellowstone for a day hiking trip to some of the areas they'd missed during their backcountry adventure. The park felt different to them now, still magnificent and inspiring, but with an added awareness of the complex challenges facing wilderness areas in an era of environmental change. We have a deeper appreciation now for both the beauty and the complexity of places like Yellowstone, Melissa observed as they stood at one of the Grand Canyon overlooks, watching steam rise from thermal features in the distance. Our experience with Bear 274 was frightening, but it also gave us insights into the wilderness that most visitors never get. Their relationship had been strengthened by the shared challenge of their bear encounter, and they found that their outdoor adventures had taken on new meaning as opportunities to observe and document changes in natural systems. They began participating in citizen science projects that helped researchers collect data about wildlife behavior and environmental conditions in wilderness areas. The Bear 274 experience taught us that every trip into the backcountry is an opportunity to contribute to our understanding of these ecosystems, Brian noted. We are more deliberate now about documenting what we observe and sharing that information with researchers and park managers. Bob Hendricks continued his research on climate change impacts on predator behavior, using data from the Bear 274 case as a foundation for broader studies of behavioral adaptation in large mammals. His work attracted attention from wildlife management agencies throughout North America, and he began consulting on similar cases in other wilderness areas. Bear 274 was just the beginning, Bob predicted during a research symposium on wildlife management challenges. Climate change is creating new pressures on predator populations that are leading to behavioral adaptations we need to understand better if we're going to manage human-wildlife interactions effectively. ODHI, the enhanced monitoring systems implemented in Yellowstone following the Bear 274 case, began detecting other instances of unusual wildlife behavior though none as extreme as the case that had prompted their installation. Early detection and intervention became key strategies for preventing the development of problematic behavior patterns in other individual animals. The monitoring network we established has already helped us identify and address several potentially problematic situations before they reach the level of the Bear 274 case, Sarah Martinez reported during an annual park management review. Early intervention appears to be much more effective than trying to modify well-established behavioral patterns. The scientific community began studying the Bear 274 case as an example of rapid behavioral adaptation in response to environmental pressures. The bear's intelligence and adaptability, while ultimately problematic from a management perspective, provided insights into how large predators might evolve strategies for surviving in landscapes increasingly influenced by human activity. Bear 274 developed behavioral strategies that would have been highly successful in an environment with abundant human-associated food sources, explained Dr. Foster during a scientific conference presentation. The bear's intelligence allowed it to recognize patterns and adapt its behavior in ways that we hadn't previously documented in wild bears. The case also highlighted the importance of long-term data collection for understanding wildlife behavior patterns and identifying emerging challenges before they reached crisis levels. Bob Hendrick's decades of research provided the baseline data necessary for recognizing that Bear 274's behavior was truly unprecedented rather than simply unusual. Without long-term monitoring data, we might have dismissed Bear 274's behavior as within the normal range of variation for grizzly bears, Bob noted in his research publications. The historical context, provided by years of observation, was crucial for recognizing that this animal represented a new category of management challenge. Educational programs developed from the Bear 274 case began emphasizing the dynamic nature of human-wildlife interactions and the need for adaptive management strategies that could respond to changing conditions. Traditional wilderness safety training was expanded to include scenarios that might arise as environmental conditions continued to change. The Bear 274 case taught us that wilderness safety education needs to evolve along with changing environmental conditions, noted Jennifer Thompson, who had been camping near Brian and Melissa during their original trip and later became involved in developing updated safety training programs. We can't assume that traditional approaches to wildlife encounters will remain adequate as animals adapt to new environmental pressures. The long-term impacts of the Bear 274 case extended far beyond Yellowstone National Park, influencing wildlife management policies and research priorities throughout North America. The case became a reference point for understanding how individual animals might adapt to environmental change in ways that create new challenges for both wildlife conservation and public safety. Bear 274 represented a convergence of factors: climate change, habitat pressure, individual intelligence, and human activity patterns that created a perfect storm of management challenges, Dr. Foster concluded in her comprehensive analysis of the case. Understanding how these factors interact will be crucial for managing similar situations that are likely to arise in other wilderness areas. The story of Brian and Melissa Duncan's interrupted honeymoon became more than just an account of a frightening wildlife encounter. It became a window into the complex challenges facing wilderness areas in an era of rapid environmental change. Their experience demonstrated both the magnificence and the unpredictability of wild places, while highlighting the importance of scientific research, careful management, and adaptive strategies for maintaining the balance between wilderness preservation and public safety. Our experience with Bear 274 changed how we think about wilderness areas and our role as visitors to these special places. Melissa reflected during a presentation to a wilderness safety training group. We learned that every trip into the backcountry is both a privilege and a responsibility, a chance to experience something extraordinary, but also an opportunity to contribute to our understanding and protection of these irreplaceable ecosystems. Years later, the lessons learned from the Bear 274 case continued to influence how wilderness managers approach the complex challenges of balancing conservation goals with public access and safety. The case remained a powerful reminder that in an era of environmental change, the wilderness experience would continue to evolve in ways that required constant vigilance, scientific understanding, and adaptive management strategies. The memory of that massive bear investigating their campsite in the pre-dawn darkness would stay with Brian and Melissa for the rest of their lives, but so would the broader lessons about resilience, adaptation, and the ongoing need to protect and understand the wild places that remain on our planet. Their story became part of the larger narrative of human interaction with wilderness in the 21st century, a story still being written by every person who ventures into the backcountry with respect, preparation, and an appreciation for both the beauty and the uncertainty that define truly wild places. In the end, Bear 274's story was a tragedy, the loss of a magnificent individual animal that had simply adapted too well to the changing conditions of its environment. But the lessons learned from that bear's brief but impactful life continued to contribute to better understanding and management of the complex relationship between humans and wildlife in an era of unprecedented environmental change. The bear's legacy lived on in improved safety protocols, enhanced scientific understanding, and a deeper appreciation for the challenges facing wilderness areas in the modern world. Brian and Melissa's experience became a testament to the importance of preparation, respect, and adaptability in wilderness settings, while also highlighting the ongoing need for scientific research and careful management to protect both wildlife populations and the human visitors who seek to experience the last remaining wild places on Earth. Their story reminded everyone that in wilderness areas we are visitors in landscapes that belong first and foremost to the wild creatures that have evolved to call these places home.